Section 1. The Comedy Time Machine. There is something genuinely strange about watching a show that used to make you laugh and realizing, somewhere between one episode and the next, that the joke landed differently this time. Not worse, necessarily. Just differently. Like reading a letter you wrote to yourself at 16 and finding a version of your own voice that feels both completely familiar and a little foreign at the same time. You recognize the rhythm of the sentences. You know the handwriting. But the distance between then and now makes the whole thing feel like it was written by someone you used to be rather than someone you still are. Family Guy has been on American television since the 31st of January 1999. That is over 26 years on the air, which makes it one of the longest-running animated series in American broadcast history. To put that kind of longevity in perspective, consider that children born the year the show premiered are now adults in their mid to late 20s. They have jobs and opinions about coffee and strong feelings about the early versus late seasons of various shows, and when you ask most of them directly about Family Guy, they will tell you with genuine conviction that, yes, the early seasons were actually better. Not just nostalgia, actually better written, actually warmer, actually more careful with the material. But what makes the early years feel different is not just the warmth, and it is not only the craft, though both of those things are real and worth talking about at length. What makes them feel different is the specific and peculiar experience of watching jokes that, when they originally aired, felt like they were pushing the edges of what television comedy was allowed to do, and which now feel like they are pushing something else entirely. Something that sits a little lower in the chest, something that takes longer to dissolve. This is what we are going to spend a long, slow, careful evening exploring together. Settle in. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Pull the blanket up if there is one close. Let the light in the room do whatever it is doing. We are not going to rush through this because this subject does not deserve rushing. We are going to take our time with each era, each category of material, each choice the show made that we are now in a position to look at from a meaningful distance. Family Guy was built, from its very foundation, on one core promise. Nothing is off limits. That was the pitch Seth MacFarlane carried into Fox's offices in 1998 when he presented a 15-minute pilot that would eventually become one of the most watched animated shows in television history. The show would go places other shows would not go. It would make jokes other writers would stop themselves before finishing. It would build an entire comedic vocabulary around transgression, around the specific willingness to look at the things polite entertainment looked away from and use them as material. Religion, politics, race, disability, the things that happen in real families that other sitcoms smoothed over, the cruelty embedded in real relationships that other shows pretended did not exist. Family Guy would not smooth anything over. For a long time, that recklessness felt like freedom. It genuinely did. It felt like the show was getting away with something every week that nothing else on television was willing to attempt. Like watching someone sprint in a direction that everyone else had been too cautious to try. And millions of people ran with it. They loved the show for exactly this reason. But comedy has a relationship with time that is unlike almost any other art form. A painting does not become less beautiful because the world around it changes. A symphony does not lose its structure because society's values have shifted. Those forms contain their own internal logic and integrity, and that integrity persists even as the culture moves. A joke is different. A joke is a product of its exact moment. It requires a shared understanding between the person telling it and the person hearing it. It requires that both parties agree, at least temporarily, on what is available to be laughed at and what the laughter means when it arrives. When that agreement dissolves, the joke does not simply stop being funny. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes a record. A small piece of evidence. A window into exactly who we were, collectively, at the moment we thought that was worth laughing at. What we are doing tonight is sitting with that evidence. Season by season, theme by theme, joke by joke, we are going to look at what Family Guy built over its run, what it celebrated and what it made light of, what it treated as harmless and what turned out not to be harmless at all. And then we are going to look at how those choices feel from where we are sitting in 2025, watching through the accumulated weight of everything that has happened in the decades since those episodes first aired. This is not an angry video. Family Guy was, and in many of its best moments still is, one of the most formally inventive animated series American television has ever produced. The show changed what adult animation could look like. It created a visual language of cutaway comedy that every show in its wake has had to reckon with. The show matters. Its history matters. Its influence is real and large and will last. And precisely because all of that is true, it deserves to be examined with real seriousness and real honesty, not defended reflexively, not condemned wholesale, but looked at carefully, with the kind of sustained attention that a 26-year body of work actually deserves. We are going to take each era of the show's history, each recurring category of joke, each character, dynamic, and creative choice that has become more complicated to watch with fresh eyes, and we are going to give it the kind of attention it deserves. We are going to ask what was happening in the culture when each piece of material was written. We are going to ask what the writers thought they were doing. We are going to ask what the people being made into punchlines experienced. And we are going to ask what we can see now that we could not or would not see when these things first aired. Along the way, something interesting is going to emerge. The jokes that aged worst on Family Guy are not scattered randomly across the show's catalog. They are not isolated misfires from otherwise careful writers who happen to have a bad day in the room. They cluster, they form patterns. And those patterns tell a very specific story about the assumptions baked into the show from its earliest episodes. Assumptions about whose discomfort makes for a legitimate punchline, whose suffering is available as comedy material, who the show imagined was watching, whose reality the show expected its imagined audience to be comfortable looking away from. Get horizontal if your body is inviting you in that direction right now. Let this be the thing that fills the quiet for the next few hours. We are going to move through it slowly and deliberately, with the kind of care the subject deserves. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something genuinely meaningful about knowing that people in completely different corners of the world are sitting with the same material at the same moment. I read every single comment on these videos, and if you have not subscribed yet, that button is somewhere nearby, and every subscription makes a real difference to what this channel can do. Now, let us start at the beginning. Section 2. Why comedy ages the way it does. Before we go episode by episode through the Family Guy archive, we need to spend real time inside the actual mechanics of why a joke stops working. Not just why it becomes unfunny in a neutral sense, but why some jokes go from generating laughter to generating something else entirely, something that sits in a different register, something that prompts a genuinely different kind of response from the audience. Understanding this underlying process makes everything we look at tonight considerably more interesting and considerably more useful than just making a list of bad moments and moving on. Comedy is built on the concept of the gap, the space between what someone expects and what actually arrives. You build an expectation in your listener, you let them lean a certain way based on everything they know and believe and assume about the world, and then you pull the support out from underneath that lean in a way they were not fully anticipating. The laugh is the body's physiological response to that surprise, a kind of involuntary release, the physical expression of having been safely tricked, of having the ground shift unexpectedly and discovering in the same moment that it was actually fine. Comedy is, at its core, a safe version of a frightening experience. You thought one thing was going to happen. Another thing happened. You survived it. That survival feels good in a specific way that the body expresses as laughter. But that gap between setup and punchline is not a fixed thing. It is not stable across time, and it is not stable across different audiences. It depends entirely on what the listener already knows, what they already believe to be true, what they are already primed to find surprising versus what they find entirely predictable. The gap is made of shared assumptions. And culture, in the broadest sense, is a vast and constantly shifting set of shared assumptions about the world. The things that seem strange, the things that seem normal, the things that seem dangerous, the things that seem harmless, all of that shifts. When it shifts, the gap shifts with it. What used to be surprising becomes expected. What used to feel like a safe transgression, a push against a boundary that was exciting rather than harmful, becomes something with real weight behind it and nothing cushioning the fall. There are three distinct categories of aging that apply to comedy in general and to Family Guy's catalog in particular. They are worth naming separately because they behave differently, they are caused by different things, and they deserve different responses. The first is what we might call the visibility problem. This is what happens to jokes about marginalized groups when those groups move closer to the center of cultural concern. When jokes of this kind are first written, they rely on a specific cultural arrangement. The group being mocked is positioned as other, as outside the mainstream, as something it is culturally acceptable to observe from a comfortable distance and find amusing. The joke works because the audience and the comedian share an implied vantage point that feels neutral to the people who occupy it. The laughter is a confirmation of that shared distance. A little moment of mutual recognition. We are here together, looking at this thing, and we agree that it is available to us in this way. What happens over time is that the distance closes. The communities that were once firmly positioned as other gain visibility. Their experiences become part of the public record in ways they were not before. Their humanity becomes harder to compartmentalize. And when that happens, the shared assumption that powered the joke is no longer reliably shared. The laugh that was once a confirmation of comfortable distance is now, for a significant portion of the audience, a laugh at someone's actual pain. And that pain is no longer invisible enough to make the joke feel consequence-free. This is the engine behind most of what we examine when we look at Family Guy's treatment of race, disability, sexual violence, and gender identity. The jokes were not made in a vacuum of good intentions that the culture subsequently polluted. They were made in a cultural environment where certain kinds of harm were invisible to the people making the jokes. What changed was not the nature of the harm. What changed was the visibility of the people experiencing it. The second category is considerably simpler. Topical comedy. Jokes about specific people, specific events, specific cultural moments that were happening in real time when the episode was written. These jokes have an expiration date built directly into their structure, and that expiration has nothing to do with social progress. It is just time. The specific person being mocked falls out of public consciousness. The event being referenced becomes something most viewers have to research to remember. The shared cultural context that made the joke land simply evaporates, and what remains is incomplete. A punchline to a joke whose setup nobody can quite recall. Family Guy has more of this second category than almost any other long-running show in history. This is a direct consequence of its format and its creative instincts. The cutaway structure allowed the show to make dozens of contemporary references per episode, references aggressively rooted in whatever was in the news cycle during the specific week the episode was being drafted. This gave the show a kind of cultural immediacy that felt exciting, but that has a very limited shelf life. The third category is the most important. These are jokes that were always wrong. Not jokes that were sharp and clever and then became insensitive as the culture evolved around them. Not jokes whose context changed. These are jokes that were causing real harm from the very first moment they aired, that were hurting real people from day one, but that operated in a cultural environment where that harm was invisible to the people in a position to stop it, or where the people being hurt did not have enough of a platform to make their experience part of the public conversation about the material in a way that anyone felt obligated to respond to. This distinction is crucial. It means that a significant portion of Family Guy's most uncomfortable moments are not cases of good intentions going wrong. They are not cases of a show trying something brave that turned out to be a mistake. They are cases of harm that was always real, finally becoming visible to people who had previously been comfortable not seeing it. Keep all three of these categories active as you move through the show's history tonight. You will see each one operating at different points, sometimes in isolation and sometimes layered on top of each other in the same moment. Distinguishing between them is how you think carefully about this material rather than simply reacting to it. There is also a concept worth naming before we go to the episodes: the butt of the joke. In comedy writing, the butt of the joke is the entity whose failure or misfortune or absurdity is the source of the audience's laughter. Good comedy tends to locate the butt of the joke in the powerful, the abstract, the absurd, or the comedian themselves. Something that can absorb the laugh without suffering for it. Comedy becomes ethically complicated when the butt of the joke is someone already vulnerable, when the thing being laughed at is someone's actual pain or marginalization or limited options in the world, and the laughter does not illuminate that situation but simply compounds it. Family Guy has always maintained as a matter of stated creative philosophy that it makes fun of everyone equally. White people, black people, Asian people, Jewish people, Catholics, Muslims, women, men. The math adds up to perfect balance, and therefore no one can reasonably complain about being singled out. This is the equal opportunity offense defense, and it has served the show as a shield for over 2 decades. It is a claim that sounds reasonable on the surface and deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives. We will give it that scrutiny when we reach the section on racial humor. For now, hold it as a claim that is going to be tested against the evidence. One more thing about the emotional texture of this evening. We are going to be spending time with material that sits in genuinely different emotional registers. Some of it will feel almost nostalgic in its wrongness, like a period artifact from a culture you recognize but no longer quite inhabit. Some of it will feel sharp and immediate. Let those different textures move through you without fighting them. They are all telling you something true about how far we have traveled and how much traveling there still is to do. Section 3. The early seasons and the jokes that were already pushing it. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy carry an almost sacred reputation among the show's longtime fans. These are the seasons people invoke when they want to argue that the show was once genuinely brilliant before later seasons hollowed it out, and that reputation is largely deserved. The early episodes are tighter, sharper, more structurally disciplined than most of what the show produced after its 2005 revival. They have character consistency that would eventually erode. They have warmth, in the specific sense of the Griffins feeling like a family that actually cared about each other underneath all the chaos. And that warmth was a genuine part of what made the Comedyland. And they have a specific creative investment, a sense that someone was paying close attention to every detail, that is distinctly present in those first 3 seasons and distinctly harder to locate in the years that followed. But here is the thing about the early seasons that tends to get lost in the nostalgia. They also contain a remarkable and revealing quantity of material that, examined honestly from where we are sitting today, tells you that the show's most problematic instincts were never something it drifted into accidentally as the years wore on. They were present from the beginning. They were baked into the show at the foundation level. Understanding this is crucial because it prevents the comfortable but misleading narrative that a good show became a bad show. What actually happened is that a show with specific foundational blind spots eventually amplified those blind spots past the point where they could be politely ignored. Let us start with the very first season, which premiered the 31st of January 1999, with an episode called Death Has a Shadow, that followed the Super Bowl and drew 22 million viewers. That is an enormous number for a cartoon, and it set the expectation that this show was going to be a phenomenon. And right there in those first episodes, alongside genuinely sharp and inventive comedy, are moments that tell you what the show was always going to be. In the Season 1 episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, the Griffin family sits down to watch the Tom Hanks film Philadelphia. Philadelphia came out in 1993 and is one of the most significant pieces of American cinema ever made about the AIDS epidemic. It follows a gay attorney named Andrew Beckett, played by Hanks, who is fired by his prestigious law firm after his employers discover he has AIDS. The film was made at a specific cultural moment, at a point when the AIDS crisis was still ongoing and killing people in catastrophic numbers, when communities most affected by it had been failed for over a decade by government indifference and social stigma, when the basic humanity of gay men with AIDS was still being contested in significant corners of American public and political life. Philadelphia was an act of advocacy, a deliberate attempt to put a human face on people who had been made invisible by their own society's willful refusal to see them. Peter in the theater watching this film finds it hilarious. Not because anything genuinely funny happens in it, but because he has decided that Tom Hanks is inherently funny in everything he does. When the character Andy Beckett announces that he has AIDS, Peter bursts out laughing. He cannot stop himself. The rest of the theater stares at him in appropriate horror. The comedic mechanism here is completely standard Family Guy logic. Peter misreads a serious situation. Everyone else responds normally. Peter's obtuseness is the source of the comedy. This is a framework the show uses many times across its history, and it frequently works well. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is the specific subject chosen for it. In 1999, the AIDS crisis was not ancient history. It was still consuming thousands of lives. The communities it had devastated were still rebuilding from losses that had been staggering. The people who had watched friends, partners, siblings, and parents die over the preceding decade and a half were still alive and still grieving. Using a film made specifically to honor those experiences as backdrop for a joke about a man too obtuse to understand human suffering requires the audience to treat the film's subject matter as something they can hold at a comfortable enough distance to find Peter's indifference amusing, rather than troubling. From 2025, with 25 additional years of cultural conversation about the AIDS epidemic, this joke is asking its audience to do something that feels considerably heavier than it seemed to ask in 1999. The same episode contains the groundwork for another recurring instinct in the show that ages badly in a different direction. There is a cutaway in the early seasons in which Adolf Hitler, drawn as an overweight, self-pitying man, watches a muscular Jewish man at the zoo and develops his genocidal ideology from a place of body image insecurity. The Holocaust, the systematic state murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, is explained here as the product of a fat man's petty jealousy. There is a long and legitimate tradition of comedy that uses the deflation of monsters to make them smaller and less frightening. Mel Brooks has talked extensively about how making Hitler a buffoon can function as a cultural weapon against the ideology he represented. Done well, this kind of comedy genuinely does something. It reduces the tyrant. But the Family Guy version does not reduce the tyrant specifically. It reduces the genocide itself, treating the Holocaust as something that can be explained away with a petty, ridiculous backstory. The joke makes the atrocity look small, not the perpetrator. Those are very different things. Season 3 brought the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, produced in 2000 and held from broadcast for years. Fox's Business Affairs division declined to air it, concerned that the episode's primary musical number, a song called I Need a Jew, sung to the tune of the Disney classic When You Wish Upon a Star, was too potentially anti-Semitic for broadcast. The episode was shelved and did not air in America until November 2003 on Adult Swim, years after it was made, with a censored version finally appearing on Fox in December 2004. The premise involves Peter realizing, based on anti-Semitic stereotypes absorbed from his cultural environment, that Jewish people are categorically and inherently better with money than non-Jewish people. He befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein and becomes so convinced of this idea that he decides to convert his son Chris to Judaism, believing the conversion will make Chris smarter and more financially successful. He takes Chris to Las Vegas for an illicit bar mitzvah. MacFarlane and the writing staff have argued strenuously across decades of interviews that the episode is satire, that Peter is the joke, not the stereotype, that the episode is constructed to show his beliefs as ignorant, and there is genuine evidence for this reading. Lois explicitly corrects Peter. The episode ultimately affirms that his reasoning was wrong. A significant portion of the Family Guy writing staff is Jewish, which was cited as evidence of good faith. But here is the enduring problem with the satire defense, and it applies across a wide range of the show's most controversial material. Satire requires the audience to be in on the joke. It requires viewers to understand that Peter's beliefs are the object of mockery, not the content of the show's own worldview. And Family Guy's relationship with its actual audience has never been one in which that level of interpretive clarity is guaranteed. The show reaches a wide, varied, and in many ways uncritical audience. Young viewers still forming their frameworks for understanding the world. Casual viewers who are not arriving with sophisticated tools for distinguishing between a show endorsing a stereotype and a show satirizing the person who holds one. When those viewers watch Peter sing a catchy parody of a beloved Disney melody in which the lyrics articulate anti-Semitic premises, what some of them take away is not a nuanced critique of Peter's ignorance. It is a catchy song containing anti-Semitic premises, delivered with a wink. The satire and the stereotype can occupy the same space simultaneously, and for viewers already primed toward the stereotype, the satirical framing provides no protection at all. The episode also generated a lawsuit. The music publisher Born Company, which holds the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox, MacFarlane, and Fuzzy Door Productions in 2007, claiming copyright infringement and arguing that the parody had caused reputational harm to their song. A federal judge ruled in 2009 that the parody was protected under fair use. The lawsuit was dismissed. But the fact that a music publisher pursued the matter in federal court for 2 years tells you something about how seriously the material was taken by people with a financial stake in the question. Also in Season 3 came the introduction of the character who will eventually become one of the most troubling recurring figures in the show's entire history. In the episode To Love and Die in Dixie, an elderly neighbor named John Herbert appears for the first time. He is soft-voiced, fragile-looking, and moves with the careful deliberateness of very old age. His attraction to Chris Griffin, Peter's teenage son, is established immediately and without ambiguity. Herbert is a pedophile. The joke is that he is a pedophile. This is the entirety of his purpose in the episode. In the early seasons, Herbert is a minor figure. He appears, the nature of his interest in Chris is made clear, and the episode moves on. The show has not yet committed to making him a recurring centerpiece. But what these first appearances establish is that the show considered child sexual predation an acceptable subject for a recurring comedy character. That foundational creative decision, made casually in 2001, would have implications the writers did not examine at the time, and that the culture has become increasingly unwilling to let them continue not examining. The early seasons also contain the first examples of what will become one of Family Guy's most consistent habits, using real tragedies and real human suffering as backdrop for casual comedy. The AIDS joke, the Holocaust joke, the Kennedy assassination Pez dispenser joke from A Hero Sits Next Door that even MacFarlane himself has subsequently said he regrets. All of these established, in the show's very first year, that human catastrophe was fair game for comedic reduction, that the gravity of real events could be deflated for a quick laugh without any particular obligation to the people those events had actually affected. This established posture is what makes the later escalations feel less like departures and more like progressions. The show did not suddenly become comfortable with reducing tragedy to comedy. It was always comfortable with it. The later seasons just got louder about it. Section 4. The Great Race Problem. Racial humor in American entertainment has a history considerably longer, more complicated, and more damaging than most casual discussions of it tend to acknowledge. The use of racial and ethnic groups as sources of cheap, easy laughter in American popular entertainment predates television by generations. Minstrelsy, racial caricature, the specific visual and linguistic shorthand of ethnic stereotype. These are features of American popular entertainment going back at least to the mid-1800s, and they persisted with remarkable durability well past the point when most people in positions of cultural influence understood, in at least an abstract way, that they caused harm. They persisted because they were commercially effective, because they required minimal creative work, and because the people most harmed by them were not in the rooms where the decisions were being made. Family Guy did not invent this tradition, but it adopted it enthusiastically and deployed it with the energy and logic of a show that believed its willingness to offend was itself a form of integrity. Understanding how that worked in practice, and why it did not hold up under scrutiny, requires looking carefully at the specific characters and moments where racial stereotyping was the primary comedic tool. Let us begin with Tricia Takanawa, the Asian-American reporter for the fictional local news station who appears as a recurring character throughout the show's history. Tricia is voiced by Alex Borstein, who also voices Lois Griffin. Alex Borstein is a white Jewish woman, and Tricia Takanawa's character is built almost entirely from a set of stereotypes about East Asian women. The cluster of assumptions about submissiveness, hypersexuality, exoticized desire, and cultural otherness that has been a persistent and harmful feature of how Asian women have been represented in American popular entertainment for well over a century. The most frequently cited Tricia moment involves her conducting a celebrity interview when she abruptly announces her attraction to her subject and declares her intention to take him home and make him fish ball soup. The joke operates simultaneously on two levels. Her loss of professional composure is funny in the abstract way any character's departure from expected professional behavior can be funny, and the specific food she names is meant to signal her ethnic identity in a way the audience is supposed to find amusing. This is what is called a straight stereotype. There is no additional layer. There is no subversion. The joke is not that Tricia is an interesting person whose cultural background is one facet of a complex character. The joke is simply, here is the stereotype. The existence and legibility of the stereotype is the comedic mechanism. The audience's familiarity with the caricature is what converts the moment into a laugh. Straight stereotypes have a particular and predictable aging trajectory. When first deployed, they work because the stereotype feels neutral to the people making it. Over time, as the communities being stereotyped gain more visibility, as their voices become more prominent in public discourse, as the people who have always experienced these stereotypes as reductive and harmful gain enough of a platform to make that experience part of the conversation, the shorthand stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like an agreement to view an entire category of people through the narrowest possible lens. The period from roughly 2015 through the present has seen a meaningful shift in the cultural conversation around Asian representation in American media, driven by the success of projects like Crazy Rich Asians, Minari, and Everything Everywhere All at Once, by the emergence of prominent Asian American creators across every field of entertainment, and very specifically by the sharp rise in anti-Asian violence and discrimination in 2020 and 2021 that made the real-world consequences of dehumanizing representation viscerally concrete. Watching those Trisha Takanawa scenes in 2025 is a genuinely different experience from watching them in 2002. Not because the scenes changed, but because everything around them did. Cleveland Brown is the other central figure in this conversation, and his story has a more recent chapter the discussion cannot be complete without. Cleveland was one of Peter's closest friends from the show's earliest episodes, voiced throughout most of the shows run by Mike Henry, who is white. In June 2020, following the broad public conversation about white voice actors playing black characters in animation, Mike Henry announced that he was stepping down from the role. His statement said that he understood the character should be played by someone who could bring their own lived experience to it. The show subsequently cast Arif Zahir, a black comedian, to voice Cleveland going forward. Henry's departure was part of a broader moment in which several white voice actors playing characters of color in animated shows made similar decisions. What the decision implicitly admitted is important. Having a white man voice a black character for over 20 years in a show that made that character's race a source of comedy on multiple occasions was something that deserved reconsideration. The casting itself encoded a specific kind of carelessness, a specific assumption that the lived experience of the character being performed was not a relevant credential for the performance. The show's defense of all of this has always been the equal offense argument. The show makes fun of everyone: white people, black people, Asian people, Jewish people. The math adds up to an even distribution, so no one can reasonably complain about being singled out. This argument rests on an assumption that a joke about a dominant group and a joke about a marginalized group are equivalent in their effect, because both are jokes about a group. But the effect of a joke is not determined solely by its structure. It is determined by the cultural environment in which it lands. A joke about white people's rhythmic limitations operates in a cultural environment where white people hold enormous institutional power and where the stereotype can be absorbed without lasting harm to social position or safety. A joke about Jewish people's inherent relationship with money operates in a cultural environment where anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have historically preceded mass violence. A joke about black men and criminality operates in a cultural environment where that specific stereotype has contributed directly to extrajudicial killings and systematic over-policing. These things are not equivalent. Presenting them as equivalent requires looking only at the surface structure of the jokes while deliberately ignoring everything about the material conditions in which those jokes operate. What is particularly frustrating is that the show has demonstrated, on specific occasions, that it is capable of something better. There are episodes across its history where racial dynamics are handled with genuine craft, where the comedy is actually at the expense of racism rather than at the expense of a racial group. When the show puts in the work, it is capable of being genuinely smart about this material. The problem is that putting in the work has never been the primary instinct. Moving fast, staying funny, filling the runtime, getting to the next cutaway, these have always been the primary instincts. And in that mode, the path of least resistance runs directly through the most available stereotype. Section 5. The Quagmire Problem. Glenn Quagmire is, on purely technical grounds, one of the most effective recurring characters in American animated comedy. He has a distinctive visual design, an immediately recognizable voice, and a verbal tick that became one of the most quoted audio clips in the show's history. His energy in scenes with Peter generates a specific kind of comic chemistry more physically immediate than any other dynamic in the show's main cast. In his earliest appearances, when he functions simply as a lovable rake with overactive appetites and correspondingly poor judgment, the character works exactly as intended. And then the seasons accumulate, and the characterization accumulates with them, and if you step back and look at the full picture of what has been built, you realize that the thing being laughed at is not just a lovable rake with bad judgment. The thing being laughed at is a character who drugs women, who has kept women captive, who has had sex with women who were incapacitated, who pursues teenagers, who operates through deception and coercion as his primary mode of engaging with potential sexual partners. The show knew this. It stated it explicitly. In a later season episode, Peter says to Quagmire directly and without apparent irony, "Quagmire, you're a rapist." The show acknowledged out loud what the character had always been, which means the decades of presenting it as charming were a choice made with awareness of what was being chosen. The mechanism by which this worked for so long is not mysterious. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a period in American popular entertainment in which the archetype of the sleazy but charming womanizer was not just tolerated but actively celebrated in film comedies, in advertising, in the broader cultural vocabulary of masculine aspiration. Family Guy was drawing from and contributing to a well-established tradition, and the audience responded to that tradition with the laughter it expected. The Season 7 episode Baby Not on Board from 2008 contains what is, on examination, the single most instructive Quagmire-adjacent moment in the show's history. A cutaway shows a woman on a beach being tackled and pinned to the ground by a man who is clearly about to assault her. Aquaman arrives. The punchline is that Aquaman cannot function unless he is in water, so he cannot help. When the woman gives one final desperate call for help, Aquaman tells her that maybe she should not have led the man on. The surface layer, the Aquaman satire, was at the time a reasonably common form of pop culture mockery, but the joke requires the scenario of a sexual assault to function, and the punchline, delivered from the position of the hero, is victim blaming. The woman is told that her behavior invited what is happening to her. This is not presented as a wrong thing to say that reveals something about Aquaman's character. It is the punchline. It is where the laugh is supposed to come from. Victim blaming, the belief that survivors of assault bear responsibility for what happened to them, is one of the most thoroughly documented and demonstrably harmful beliefs in the cultural landscape around sexual violence. Studies of jury behavior in assault trials have found this belief influences verdicts toward acquittal. Studies of reporting rates have found that survivors frequently do not report precisely because they anticipate being asked what they did to bring this on themselves. The belief is an active mechanism through which assault survivors are failed by every system designed to protect them. The show used it as a punchline in 2008. The Me Too movement, which gained its most significant cultural momentum in October 2017, changed the landscape around this kind of material in fundamental ways. It gave sustained public platform to survivors of assault in numbers never achieved before. It made visible, to an audience that had not been paying consistent attention, the scale and normalcy of sexual misconduct in positions of power, and in doing so, it made it considerably harder to watch a show treat sexual assault as comedic backdrop without feeling the weight of what was being minimized. Family Guy's own writers understood this. Showrunner Rich Appel announced at San Diego Comic-Con in 2018 that they were developing an episode specifically addressing Quagmire's history in the context of what the movement had made impossible to ignore. McFarlane himself was described as personally involved in developing that episode. In a Season 18 episode, Quagmire faces explicit consequences for harassing a woman at work. By the show's standards, and in the context of the character's full history, this was a genuine reckoning. But the reckoning arrived after 2 decades of the opposite. By 2018, the writers knew that what they had been doing with Quagmire had been harmful. They knew that 20 years of presenting his predatory behavior as lovable and charming was wrong enough to require formal acknowledgement and formal response, which means the harm was real and they understood it was real, which means it was always real. The awareness did not create the harm. The awareness simply made the harm undeniable to people who had previously been able to deny it. Every episode from those preceding 20 years is still there. They still air in syndication. They are still on streaming platforms. The clips are still watched millions of times. The record exists, and the record says specific things about what the show considered appropriate and appealing across the full duration of the character's comedic life. There is also Quagmire's history with underage girls. In the season 11 episode, Quagmire's Mom, the character is arrested for having had sex with a teenager. The episode provides him with partial exculpation through the device of the teenager having lied about her age, and Quagmire is ultimately saved from prison through a legal maneuver. The episode is entirely structured as comedy, and Quagmire's own stated attitude toward the situation is more pride than remorse. The Parents Television Council filed a formal indecency complaint with the Federal Communications Commission over this episode in February 2015, citing jokes about statutory assault as grounds for enforcement action. No enforcement action was taken. The show continued. What Quagmire represents in the show's history is a specific and well-documented failure of institutional accountability enabled by commercial success. The show's ratings, the audience's affection for the character, the merchandise revenue, all of these functioned as reasons not to examine what was actually being celebrated. The accountability came later, as it usually does, and at the cost of the 2 decades that preceded it. Section 6. The Meg Problem. If there is one thing in Family Guy's long and complicated history that, when you look at it fully and honestly, generates something that feels less like the mild discomfort of watching edgy comedy and more like genuine moral disturbance, it is what the show chose to do with Meg Griffin across roughly 10 seasons of her existence on screen. Meg is the oldest child of Peter and Lois Griffin. In the first season, she was voiced by Lacey Chabert. From season 2 onward, Mila Kunis has voiced her, a role she has maintained for over 2 decades. In the earliest episodes, Meg was a simple and deliberately understated character, a teenage girl who was ordinary by the specific standards of her extraordinary family, who wanted to be liked at school, who had the recognizable social anxieties of adolescence without the outrageous amplification that surrounded every other member of the Griffin household. She was the most normal member of a very abnormal family. The contrast was the joke. The ordinary person in a circus of extraordinary personalities. That characterization worked precisely because it was grounded. A significant portion of the show's audience could find something in Meg that resonated without irony. They recognized her. The teenager who feels like the least interesting person in the room, who wants to be included and keeps not quite managing it, who tries to be normal in a context where normal seems impossible. That is not a comedic abstraction. That is a specific and widespread human experience. What happened to that characterization over the following 10 seasons is one of the most sustained and least defensible creative decisions any American television comedy has made in the modern era. Beginning in season 4 and escalating dramatically through seasons 5, 6, 7, 8, and beyond, reaching a kind of horrible peak in the stretch from season 8 through season 14, Meg became the show's designated punching bag. Not in the abstract and almost affectionate way that some shows use a single character as the butt of jokes. In a way that was specific, sustained, physical, verbal, and relentless. Peter, who in the earliest episodes was merely an inattentive and occasionally insensitive father, became by the middle seasons actively and explicitly abusive toward his daughter in ways that went well beyond the bounds of any defensible comedic exaggeration. He farted in her face as a form of entertainment. He physically shoved her. He made explicit, repeated, stated wishes for her to not exist. In a flashback presented as a joke, it is revealed that Peter and Lois attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was a baby. The show expects the audience to laugh at the idea of parents trying to get rid of their infant daughter. Lois, who was supposed to be the reasonable counterweight to Peter's chaos, developed across the middle seasons her own cold and specific cruelty toward Meg, a pattern of dismissing her emotional needs, minimizing her pain, and treating her concerns as inconveniences rather than as a daughter's legitimate experiences to be engaged with. Chris joined in, Stewie joined in, the extended supporting cast of the show, the neighbors, the classmates at James Woods Regional High School, even characters appearing for a single episode with no prior relationship to Meg, are consistently shown responding to her with reflexive disgust and open cruelty. The show built and maintained an entire fictional universe in which the appropriate response to Meg Griffin's existence was revulsion, and it maintained that universe with remarkable consistency across roughly a decade. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the episode that crystallized, for a large portion of longtime viewers and critics who had been watching the Meg arc develop, exactly what the show was actually doing with all of this material. The family is trapped indoors during a hurricane. Meg, after years and years of accumulated treatment the audience has watched being piled onto her, finally speaks. She stands in the living room and addresses her family one by one, telling each of them in specific, detailed, undeniable terms exactly what they are and exactly what they have done. She tells Peter that he is a selfish, irresponsible, abusive father who terrorizes his family with his impulsive behavior and treats his daughter with casual cruelty. She tells Lois that she is a bad mother who uses Meg as an emotional receptacle for her own dysfunction. She addresses Chris and Brian with equal directness and equal specificity. It is a genuinely powerful sequence. It is, structurally, the kind of moment a well-crafted, long-running show builds toward deliberately across many seasons. The release of accumulated tension, the confrontation with accumulated truth, the moment when the audience's full understanding of everything that has happened before finds its expression in a single scene. Because the audience has watched the foundation of this speech being laid across season after season, the speech lands with real force. It feels earned. It feels necessary. And then the episode makes its choice. After Meg's outburst, the rest of the family begins to fall apart. Without their shared target, they turn on each other. The dysfunction that was previously being channeled into abuse of Meg has no outlet, and the household collapses into internal conflict. The episode ends with Meg voluntarily going to Brian and essentially agreeing to take it all back. She accepts that her role in the family is to be the lightning rod, the absorber of dysfunction, the person whose presence and availability for abuse keeps everyone else functional. She agrees to go back to being the target. Everything resets. The show intended this as something like tragic wisdom. The episode wants the audience to understand Meg's choice as a form of mature self-awareness, even a form of quiet power. But the message that actually comes through the screen, stripped of that interpretive generosity and read as what it plainly says, deserves direct statement. The episode tells its audience that some people's designated job is to be hurt so that others can be okay. That standing up for yourself against abuse is selfish because it disrupts the abusers. That the correct response to years of sustained mistreatment is to accept your designated role in the system that is harming you and return to it so that the system can continue to function. This message, delivered in this form, to an audience that includes young people still forming their understanding of what relationships are supposed to look like, is not a tragic observation about how dysfunctional families sometimes operate. It is a model. It is an example of how to understand a certain kind of situation. And the situation it models, a young woman in a family that treats her with ongoing contempt, accepting that treatment as her appropriate role, is not fictional in any meaningful sense. It is a situation that many people watching that episode recognize from their own lives. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg for over 20 years, has spoken publicly about the real-world dimension of this. She has described situations where people, strangers in public, would approach her and deliver Peter's dismissive catchphrase to her directly, apparently finding it funny to deploy the fictional expression of contempt toward the woman who gave the character her voice. The fictional cruelty had found its way into her actual life through the mouths of audience members who had absorbed it as entertainment. The show did eventually pull back from the most extreme iterations of the Meg abuse material. Around seasons 14 and 15, the treatment became less consistently extreme, and by season 22, the most severe material had largely ceased. Some credit for this has been attributed to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who reportedly pushed back against the relentlessness of the Meg material and advocated for storylines that treated her as an actual character rather than a surface onto which the show could project an endless series of cruelties. But the decade of material that preceded this shift is the record. 10 seasons. Hundreds of individual moments and episodes and storylines, each one individually small, collectively enormous. A decade of content in which the show's stated and demonstrated position was that this particular teenage girl deserved whatever was done to her, and the correct audience response was laughter. Section 7. The Celebrity Casualty List. Comedy has always used famous people as material, and this is not inherently wrong. Satire aimed at people in positions of public visibility and power has a genuine and important function. When it is working properly, celebrity-based comedy says something true about the nature of fame, the absurdity of public performance, the gap between carefully constructed public image and private reality. At its best, Family Guy has done exactly this. There are celebrity-based moments across the show's history that are sharp, well-crafted, and genuinely illuminating in the way good satire should be illuminating. But there is another category of celebrity joke in the Family Guy catalog that appears with considerable frequency across many seasons, and it is not satirical in any meaningful sense. It is simply the use of a specific real person's specific suffering, their medical condition, their personal tragedy, their most painful and private vulnerability as raw material for a punchline, without insight, commentary, or an illuminating angle. Just the pain itself, at volume, with a laugh track. Michael J. Fox is the central figure in this category. Fox was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1991, at the age of 29, while still one of the most commercially successful and widely beloved actors in Hollywood. He disclosed his diagnosis publicly in 1998, the same year MacFarlane was pitching the Family Guy pilot. Since going public, Fox has devoted an enormous portion of his professional life to Parkinson's research advocacy. His foundation has raised over $1.5 billion for research funding since its founding in 2000. By any honest measure, he is one of the most generous and constructive public figures in American life. A man who took one of the worst things that can happen to a person and redirected his energy toward helping everyone else who would receive the same diagnosis. Family Guy made jokes about Michael J. Fox's Parkinson's disease on multiple occasions across multiple seasons over many years. The most famous is from the Season 9 episode, Teagues for Two, in which Peter explains that one of his white shirts was ruined at a dinner party when Fox spilled wine on it. What makes this joke specific and worth examining is not only its content but its framing. Before the cutaway depicting the incident, Peter turns directly to the camera and addresses the viewer. He says he is not sure he should show this. He explains what happened in words, without showing it, expressing hesitation about the potential to offend. He describes the joke in full, while ostensibly declining to make it. And then, after this extended performance of hesitation, the show cuts to the joke anyway, Fox shaking uncontrollably due to his Parkinson's symptoms and spilling the wine. This framing structure, the meta-performance of reluctance followed by the delivery of the original joke entirely intact, was the show's attempt to transform the material into something more sophisticated than a straightforward disability joke. The self-awareness was supposed to function as a layer of commentary. The show was, in theory, making a joke about making a bad joke. This is a real comedic strategy, and there are contexts in which it can genuinely shift the meaning of problematic material. But meta-awareness as a defense mechanism for harmful content only functions if it actually changes something, if it makes the audience feel implicated in their laughter rather than simply permitted to laugh. What the Teagues for Two framing actually does is provide the writers with plausible deniability while delivering the original joke entirely intact. The depiction of Fox's tremors still happens. It is still the visual punchline. The meta layer does not remove it from the screen. It just provides the writers with a story about having hesitated. Fox himself has responded to this kind of material with extraordinary grace, frequently noting his own willingness to make humor about his condition. His grace is worth honoring as an expression of his character, but his capacity to absorb the jokes on his own behalf does not determine whether the jokes were appropriate to make. And most importantly, the jokes were not made about Fox alone. They were made about Parkinson's disease, a condition shared by more than 1 million Americans, the vast majority of whom are not public figures with platforms and resources, and the resilience that comes from decades of living openly with a high-profile diagnosis. They are ordinary people trying to navigate a progressive neurological illness, and they watch their condition become a recurring punchline on one of the most watched shows in American television. The JFK Pez dispenser joke from the first season episode A Hero Sits Next Door represents a different category, Assassination comedy. A child exits a store with a JFK PEZ dispenser, which is accidentally discharged by a police officer. The child, unperturbed, produces a Bobby Kennedy dispenser as a backup, the implicit joke being that both Kennedy brothers were assassinated. MacFarlane has been public about his regret over this joke. He has called it one he would not include today. He has said it went too far. This is one of the rare moments in Family Guy's history where the creator has offered a direct, specific, public admission that a particular joke was wrong. That admission is worth taking seriously and giving credit for. What it also does, somewhat unintentionally, is illuminate where MacFarlane's personal line was in the early seasons. He drew it at a joke about presidential assassination. That joke crossed the line. The Holocaust body image joke apparently did not. The Philadelphia movie joke apparently did not. The line he identified, the place where his instinct for having gone too far finally registered, was specifically with a joke about two politically murdered men. Understanding where that line was located helps us understand why so much other material passed through the writer's room without the same instinct firing. The Bill Cosby material exists in its own unusual category. Family Guy made several jokes referencing Cosby's television persona and, in later seasons, jokes specifically about his alleged behavior with women. These later jokes were written and aired before the allegations against Cosby reached the kind of sustained public attention that would result in his 2018 conviction for aggravated indecent assault. What the show's Cosby jokes now occupy is a strange moral space. They were more factually accurate than the culture was ready to acknowledge at the time they were made. But accuracy is not the only criterion by which comedy should be evaluated. Those jokes were received, in their original context, as edgy provocations against a still respected public figure. They functioned as shock material. That context has been entirely replaced by a grimmer and more specific reality in which the comedy retroactively functions as something it was never designed to be. Section 8. When they tried to be progressive and missed, the Season 8 episode Quagmire's Dad, which aired on the 9th of May 2010, is the most discussed and most consistently cited example in the entire Family Guy catalog of what happens when genuinely good intentions produce genuinely harmful execution. It continues to generate discussion 15 years after it aired, because the story of how it came to be, how it was received, and what MacFarlane has subsequently said about it is itself a compressed and unusually transparent history of how well-intentioned American entertainment can fail the communities it believes it is supporting. The episode's premise: Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, a decorated naval officer who served as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, comes to visit and reveals that he is a transgender woman. She has been living inauthentically for her entire life and has decided to have gender-affirming surgery, henceforth to be known as Ida Davis. The Quagmire storyline follows Glenn coming to terms with this revelation. The parallel storyline follows Brian, who meets a beautiful woman at a hotel bar, falls for her immediately, and sleeps with her without knowing her history. The following morning, Brian learns from Stewie that the woman he spent the night with is both Quagmire's father and a transgender woman. Brian's response is to vomit, continuously, for approximately 30 full seconds of uninterrupted screen time. He then attempts to scrub himself in the shower. He refers to Ida using dehumanizing language, calling her "it" in one moment, and comparing the situation to having slept with a sex offender. MacFarlane was genuinely proud of this episode. Before it aired, in an interview with the LGBT media website AfterElton.com, he described it as probably the most sympathetic portrayal of a transsexual character that has ever been on television. He anticipated that the transgender community would be pleased. GLAAD reviewed the episode and issued a statement calling it incredibly offensive to transgender people. AfterElton.com's reviewer graded it negatively. The response from LGBTQ advocacy organizations was nearly uniform in its assessment that the episode had failed significantly. The core tension is the gap between stated intention and actual execution. The intention was sympathetic. The episode is structured so that Quagmire's eventual acceptance of Ida is the emotional resolution. The moral framework is pro-acceptance. None of that is in dispute. But the execution communicated something different from the intention, through the specific choice of what to make emotionally dominant. Brian's 30 seconds of violent vomiting is the thing people remember from this episode. It is the scene most widely shared and cited and analyzed across 15 years of discussion. And what it communicates, regardless of the interpretive context the episode tries to build around it, is this. The correct emotional response to discovering that you have slept with a transgender woman is visceral, sustained, physical revulsion. A well-crafted piece of satire or commentary would either position this response as wrong and ensure the audience understands it as wrong, or would use the response itself as the thing being criticized and examined. What the episode does instead is present Brian's revulsion and then present Quagmire's acceptance, as though these are two separate storylines that can be run simultaneously without one undermining the other. The episode does not call out Brian's response as transphobic. It does not frame his reaction as a failure of empathy that requires correction. It presents it as a natural, if extreme, response to an unusual situation. The culture around transgender identity and representation has changed significantly since 2010. Transparent premiered in 2014, Laverne Cox appeared on Orange is the New Black and received the first Primetime Emmy nomination of an openly transgender performer. Caitlyn Jenner's Vanity Fair cover in 2015 generated the most extensive mainstream media conversation about transgender experience American journalism had ever produced. The documentary Disclosure, released on Netflix in 2020, provided a systematic examination of how media representations of trans people, specifically dehumanizing representations, connect to real-world violence against trans people. This accumulation of evidence and context now surrounds the episode in ways that make it very difficult to watch in 2025, with the same eyes one might have brought to it in 2010. MacFarlane was asked directly about the episode in a 2022 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. He said he would not make significant changes to it. He said the intent was always to portray Quagmire's father as a war hero worthy of respect, and he believed the episode achieved that. His position was that the intent was the relevant consideration. The intent was good. The execution communicated something different from the intent. And in the years since the episode aired, the gap between those two things has become considerably less comfortable to paper over with good intentions alone. The show's history with gay humor outside Quagmire's dad follows a consistent pattern of caricature deployed without craft. For many seasons, jokes relying on exaggerated presentation and assumed behaviors appeared regularly in cutaways that moved through their targets quickly and without evident thought about what they were actually saying. In 2019, showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin publicly announced that the show would be phasing out gay jokes. Then, roughly 2 seasons later, the phase-out appeared to stall. The announcement functioned more as a statement of aspiration than a commitment backed by structural change. This pattern of publicly acknowledging a problem and then resuming the behavior that constituted the problem appears in Family Guy's history often enough to qualify as a pattern rather than an anomaly. Herbert the Pervert requires its own direct examination here. Herbert first appeared in the Season 3 episode To Love and Die in Dixie in 2001. He was created and voiced by Mike Henry. The decision to make the character a pedophile was made collaboratively in the writers' room, where someone pitched the specific nature of Herbert's attraction to the writers, and the room ran with it. By the middle seasons, Herbert had become one of the most frequently used recurring characters in the entire cast. He appeared in dozens of episodes. He had a beloved decrepit dog named Jesse. He had a World War II veteran backstory. Fan discussions of him are warm. Lists of best recurring characters frequently include him near the top. The joke is the contrast between Herbert's presentation and his nature. He looks fragile and harmless. He sounds soft and gentle, with a voice that is almost grandmotherly in its cadence. And he is, explicitly and plainly and without ambiguity, a sexual predator who pursues Chris Griffin using methods including luring him with treats, attempting to drug him, constructing elaborate traps to get him alone, and systematically working to isolate Chris from adults who might protect him. These are the specific methods that real-world child sexual abuse perpetrators use. This is not inference. It is documented in research literature on child sexual abuse with considerable specificity. Perpetrators build trust. They cultivate access. They use gifts and treats and special attention as lures. They work toward isolation. The attributes that make Herbert funny as a character, the softness, the seeming harmlessness, the patient and dedicated pursuit of a child's companionship are precisely the attributes that in real-world contexts allow predators to operate undetected and unchallenged for extended periods of time. The show has never engaged with this dimension of the character. Herbert has been a beloved figure in the show's comedy universe. What has become increasingly difficult to hold at a comfortable distance, as the cultural conversation about child protection has become more prominent and more centered on the experiences of survivors, is the specific transaction being made when the audience laughs at Herbert. The transaction is this: we agree to find a predator's obsession with a child charming and warm. We agree to like this character. And what that agreement does to the audience's implicit understanding of what real-world predation can look like, and how easy it is to laugh at rather than recognize, is a question the show has never had to answer and has never tried to. Section 9. The banned episodes and the ones that survived. The history of which Family Guy episodes were considered too extreme for broadcast is itself a revealing document, and the most revealing thing about it is the logic that determined what crossed the line. The decisions about what was too much for broadcast in any given year were not made by anyone with a coherent ethical framework grounded in the question of harm. They were made by broadcast network executives responding to anticipated advertiser concerns, potential legal exposure, and the political climate around broadcast standards at the moment they had to decide. The logic was not, this would hurt people, therefore we should not air it. The logic was, this would hurt our revenue stream, therefore we should not air it. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced in 2000 and held from broadcast for years, Fox declined to air the episode because the anticipated advertiser response to its content would have been commercially damaging. Not because the content was harmful to Jewish viewers, but because the blowback from that harm would be commercially inconvenient. The episode existed. Its content existed. Fox's concern was not with the harm, but with the visibility of the harm to people in a position to pull advertising. Partial Terms of Endearment is the episode that exposes this logic most clearly, because it is the most thoughtful and most carefully executed episode in the entire list of episodes Fox refused to air. The episode deals with Lois becoming a surrogate mother and facing the decision of whether to continue the pregnancy after the intended parents are killed in an accident. It engages seriously with a genuinely difficult moral question. It was refused by Fox and has never aired on American broadcast television. It premiered on BBC Three in the United Kingdom in June 2010 and is available on DVD and streaming platforms. MacFarlane's frustration with this refusal was publicly expressed and genuinely well-founded. He pointed out, correctly, the irony of a network willing to air content involving graphic violence, rape jokes, explicit racial caricature, and a recurring pedophile character drawing the line at a nuanced treatment of abortion. The line Fox drew was not about ethical content, it was about commercial risk. Abortion in the American broadcast landscape of 2010 was a guaranteed generator of organized advertiser pressure from anti-abortion groups with significant commercial leverage. The calculation was simple. The heat was not worth the revenue. Meanwhile, the violence, the rape jokes, the trans content that GLAAD called incredibly offensive, the character who is explicitly a pedophile, all of these generated complaints. But they generated complaints from groups without sufficient commercial leverage to make the network do anything about it. The suppress and allow divide was not a moral divide. It was a power divide. The Juice is Loose from Season 7, which aired in 2009, features Peter befriending O.J. Simpson and treating him as a welcome and delightful presence in the neighborhood. The episode was written at a point in the cultural timeline when the 1,994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman had receded for a substantial portion of the viewing audience into the territory of cultural mythology. Enough time had passed that a significant proportion of viewers processed the events of 1,994 through a lens of ironic distance rather than raw proximity. From the present moment, with the intervening decades including multiple documentary series, comprehensive journalistic re-examinations, and a sustained cultural reckoning with the case and its racial dimensions, the episode's light comedic treatment of a man widely believed to have killed two people carries considerably more weight. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were real people with names and families. They have families who have spent the decades since their murders watching the man acquitted of those deaths be treated by various corners of popular culture as a colorful and amusing public figure. The episode is a document of how comfortable a certain kind of entertainment was treating that situation as a premise for comedy. The same episode contains a moment that deserves its own brief but direct attention. In a scene at a grave, Peter reveals that he had a son named Peter Jr. who died in infancy. The cause is delivered as a punchline. Peter explains that he thought if he shook the baby enough, the crying would stop. He adds that he was, in a sense, right. This is using an infant's death, explicitly described as caused by shaking, as a comedy punchline. Shaken baby syndrome is a real category of catastrophic infant brain injury. It kills and severely disables hundreds of children each year in the United States. Using it as a punchline, in an episode also featuring jokes about two real murder victims, tells you something about what the show considered appropriate comedy raw material in 2009. Section 10. The shock value spiral. There is a meaningful difference between dark humor and the escalation of shock for its own sake. Dark humor uses darkness as a vehicle. It takes something frightening, painful, or taboo and finds an angle that transforms it, an unexpected turn that makes the darkness legible as something different from itself. You laugh because you have been led somewhere you did not expect and found that you could survive the journey. The darkness serves something. The darkness earns the laugh. Shock value for its own sake dispenses with the vehicle entirely. No surprise, no transformation, no new angle, no insight. Just the thing itself, at maximum intensity, with the assumption that sheer extremity will produce the response that actual craft would otherwise have to earn. Family Guy started out, at its best, in the first category. The dark moments in the early seasons tend to have structure. They have setup, development, and a punchline that rewards sitting with uncomfortable material. Even the most controversial early moments, the ones we have discussed at length in earlier sections, are moments that were trying to do something specific. They were using darkness as a delivery system rather than as its own destination. What happened as the show extended through its middle and later seasons is a gradual shift in the relationship between structure and content. The structures became thinner, the dark content became louder, and eventually, in enough individual moments to constitute a clear pattern, the darkness stopped being a vehicle for anything and simply became the point itself. The physical violence in the show traces this shift most clearly. In the early seasons, the physical comedy involving Peter was of the classic animated variety. He falls, he crashes into things. He gets into exaggerated physical conflicts. The giant chicken fights, introduced in the second season and used as recurring spectacle throughout the show's history, are elaborate sequences of over-the-top animated combat played for comedy through sheer absurdity and the escalating preposterousness of their duration. They work because they are ridiculous, because the violence exists entirely within the register of cartoon exaggeration, where nobody is suffering in a way that invites real emotional engagement. As the seasons accumulated, the violence became more graphically detailed in its depiction of actual injury. Characters sustained injuries rendered with anatomical specificity that had no precedent in the show's early years. Exposed brain tissue following head impacts, eyes displaced from their sockets in ways drawn with medical accuracy, chainsaw wounds and gunshot wounds depicted with a degree of physical detail that belonged more naturally to horror than to animated comedy. The cartoon framing, which in the early seasons provided real and effective distance between the depicted violence and any sense of actual consequence, began to feel like an increasingly thin membrane stretched over material, reaching towards something more disturbing than the genre of animated comedy usually accommodates. This escalation followed a discoverable logic. The show found empirically, across many seasons and many viewer responses, that extreme content produced a strong audience reaction. It began using extremity as a reliable and relatively low-effort lever to pull when it needed a reaction. When a visual gag was not working in the early seasons, the solution was usually to restructure the joke or cut it. When a visual gag was not working in the later seasons, the more common solution was to extend it, to push it further, to add more graphic detail, on the theory that if the first pass did not generate the response, then more intensity would eventually produce it. This is the logic of escalation rather than craft, and it produces a different kind of entertainment from what craft produces. The prom night dumpster baby sequence from the season 5 episode Airport Zero 07 is one of the most frequently cited examples of the show drawing from real human tragedy in a way that the underlying tragedy's weight makes very difficult to defend. The sequence is modeled on the 1997 case of Melissa Drexler, a New Jersey teenager who gave birth during her senior prom night and left the infant in a trash bin, returning to the dance floor. The infant died. Drexler was convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Family Guy version involves a singing, dancing, performing baby in a dumpster, accompanied by a full backing chorus of other dumpster babies, delivered with the cheerful energy of a full production number. Using a real infant's death as a backdrop for a dance number raises a question that depends entirely on what you believe comedy is for and what you believe the audience owes the people whose real experiences it processes for. Entertainment. The gross-out humor represents another dimension of the show's escalation. In the early seasons, gross-out moments appear occasionally as accents in otherwise conventionally structured comedy sequences. They are brief and not the primary source of the joke's power. In the later seasons, extended gross-out sequences become standalone set pieces. Bodily functions, anatomical specificity, medical scenarios rendered with unnecessary detail, fill time in episodes whose structural skeletons have become thin enough that the gross-out content is no longer seasoning but main dish. The Conway-Twitty cutaways represent the most extreme version of this logic. These were simply extended performances of a country music song, unedited and uncommented upon, playing in full while the main story paused entirely and the audience waited for the show to resume. The first time, this is a genuinely surprising choice with a kind of found absurdism that functions as meta-commentary on the cutaway format itself. By the third and fourth iterations, the only honest description is that the show was filling time with a country music performance because it was easier than writing comedy. The Peter Griffin knee injury gag is another frequently cited example, a sequence in which Peter hurts his knee and then sits on the ground, making the same vocal sound repeatedly for 30 to 40 seconds. The idea seemed to be that if you took a joke that was funny for 5 seconds and stretched it to 60 seconds, it would become funny again through sheer commitment. Sometimes this worked. Most of the time, it just felt like padding. The show was aware of this too. In the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode and observe the characters standing around awkwardly during a cutaway, just waiting in silence for it to end. The joke is that the characters have nothing to do during these gags except stand there. It is a funny meta moment that also accidentally highlights the exact problem critics had been pointing out for years. The cutaways take the characters out of the story and leave them with nothing to do. The show knew this. It chose to keep doing it. Section 11. Politics, news cycles, and the comedy that expires. Every comedy show that engages with contemporary culture faces a version of the aging problem that is different in kind from the social and ethical dimensions we have spent most of this evening examining. This is the simpler version, the more benign version in important respects. Jokes about specific people and specific events and specific cultural moments that are happening right now have a shelf life determined entirely by how long those people and events remain in the active cultural memory. When that memory fades, the joke does not become harmful. It just becomes opaque. Family Guy has produced more material in this category than almost any other long-running television show. This is a direct consequence of the show's format and its creative instincts. The cutaway structure was ideal for topical references. A character says something that triggers a cultural association, the show cuts to a depiction of that association for a few seconds, it cuts back. The episode can be saturated with contemporary material in a way that a more conventionally structured comedy cannot manage. The show took full advantage of this, filling episodes with references to whatever was in the news cycle or in the entertainment press in the specific week when the episode was being drafted. This was enormously effective in the show's early and middle years. The ability to respond to the news cycle with animated comedy, to put a version of whatever everyone was talking about on screen within the production timeline of an animated series, gave Family Guy a specific kind of immediacy that felt alive. But current is temporary by definition, And the accumulated weight of Family Guy's topical material now includes enormous swaths of content that requires significant contextual reconstruction to understand it all. Episodes from the Bush administration years depict political figures and controversies that have receded from active cultural memory. Episodes from the early Obama years engage with hopes and anxieties specific to that particular cultural moment. The specific cultural references that drove cutaway content across 26 seasons, the specific songs, films, television shows, public scandals, internet phenomena, and celebrity moments that the show built jokes around. Many of these now require the viewer to be carrying specific background knowledge that fewer people carry with every passing year. This is the mildest and most forgivable category of aging in the show's catalog. No harm is done when a joke about a 2006 cultural reference becomes opaque in 2025. It is simply the nature of topical comedy as a form. The jokes were designed for their moment, and their moment passed. What is worth examining is what this pattern reveals about the show's relationship to its own comedy across time. The investment in topical material came at a direct and quantifiable cost to the craft of building material that would remain funny over time. A joke about a specific political scandal from 2010 that made an audience roar in 2010 was, in a practical sense, borrowing laughter against a future in which the joke would be worthless. The show made that trade consistently and deliberately. It prioritized the immediate laugh over the durable joke. The result is an archive that contains a very large quantity of material that was genuinely funny in its moment and is now inert. The Venezuelan ban on Family Guy following the Season 7 episode 420 is one of the most dramatic examples of topical humor generating consequences its writers did not anticipate. The episode features Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town. Venezuela's justice minister announced that cable stations in Venezuela would face fines if they continued to broadcast it, characterizing the episode as American propaganda promoting drug use. The writers did not write 420 thinking about Venezuela. The episode was a domestic American comedy about domestic American cannabis politics, written for a domestic American audience. The writers did not contemplate the possibility that the episode would be received in a completely different geopolitical context with completely different stakes. And yet it reached Venezuela. It reached every country where the show aired. It landed in contexts that its writers had not imagined and could not have fully prepared for. This is the specific tension that global distribution creates for topically rooted comedy. Material written for one cultural context is consumed in hundreds of cultural contexts simultaneously. The show's responses to the various international controversies it has generated over the years have generally been of the "we did not intend offense" variety, which is honest but is not the same as having engaged seriously with what it means to produce entertainment at this scale. The show's approach to specific political figures has also aged in uneven and sometimes uncomfortable directions. Episodes built around specific political figures rely on the continued cultural salience of those figures, and salience changes. Some figures who were prominent objects of satire in the mid-2000s have receded from the public conversation almost entirely. Others have grown in historical significance in ways that make jokes about them feel different in retrospect. The specific comedic takes on Bush-era politics, Obama-era politics, and the political controversies of each period in between read now as period documents rather than as timeless comedy. They capture the specific anxieties and preoccupations of their specific moments, and the comedy works only insofar as those anxieties and preoccupations are still legible to the viewer. Section 12. The lasting record. We have spent a long and careful evening with a body of material that deserves exactly this kind of careful, sustained attention. We have moved through the mechanics of why comedy ages, through the specific patterns in Family Guy's history where those mechanics produced outcomes that are difficult to look at without feeling some weight. We have examined race and gender and identity and disability and shock value, and the economics of broadcast standards and the cumulative meaning of a decade of abuse directed at a single character. We have looked at specific episodes, specific jokes, specific characters, and we have tried to understand not just what they are, but what they reveal about the assumptions built into the show's creative foundation. What we have not done, and what we are going to do now as we close this evening, is ask what all of it means, not what we should do about it in some prescriptive sense, not whether the show should be pulled from streaming or whether particular episodes should be locked away. Those questions generate more heat than light and are not what this is for. What we are asking is, what does it mean for us, as viewers who care about this show and its history, to sit with the full record? The first thing that emerges from that question is a challenge to a particular and very common way of thinking about cultural aging that is ultimately more comfortable than it is honest. This is the framing that says the show was fine then, the world changed, and now the show looks bad. This framing locates the problem outside the show, in the movement of the culture rather than in the choices that were made. It implies that the writers were doing their best with the tools available to them, and that the arrival of new cultural knowledge has simply changed the context around otherwise reasonable creative decisions. But we have seen over the course of this evening that this framing does not hold up for a significant portion of the material. The harm caused by making sexual violence a comedic backdrop was not invisible in 2007. Survivors of assault existed in 2007. They were watching Family Guy. They had already told anyone willing to listen exactly what those jokes felt like. The harm caused by depicting a transgender woman as a source of extended vomiting was not a discovery of the post-transparent era. Trans people existed in 2010. They had already repeatedly made their experience of this kind of depiction audible to people willing to pay attention. The harm caused by a decade of abuse directed at Meg Griffin was not a new understanding generated by contemporary mental health discourse. People who had experienced family dynamics like Meg's were watching those episodes when they aired. What changed was not the existence of the harm. What changed was the cultural weight given to the testimony of the people experiencing it. What changed was whose account of what the jokes meant was considered authoritative. When a show's defense of its own material is that people who are not being harmed by the joke find it funny, that defense was always insufficient. The question has always been, what do the people the joke is about have to say about it? And for a long time, that question was not treated as a serious one. The second thing that emerges is a challenge to the idea of the show as a monolith, as something that is either defensible or indefensible as a whole. The actual record of Family Guy is considerably more complicated than either of those positions allows. The same show that produced a decade of systematic abuse directed at a teenage girl also produced Brian and Stewie, the season 8 episode in which two characters are locked in a bank vault and spend the entire episode having honest, sometimes devastating conversations about their friendship, their fears, and the specific weight of their lives. There are no cutaways in that episode, no topical jokes, no shock value. Just two characters talking, and the writing is exceptional by the standards of any show in any format. The same show that built Quagmire as a comedic presentation of serial sexual predation also produced moments of genuine, surprising emotional intelligence in Brian and Stewie's relationship, in the specific texture of Peter and Lois's marriage in the early seasons, in the handful of episodes across the show's history where Meg was written as a full human being, and the comedy came from her actual interiority rather than from other characters' contempt for her. These things coexist. They are the work of the same writers, the same creative infrastructure, the same production machine. Their coexistence is the most instructive fact about the show, because it tells you that the capacity for genuine human comedy was always present. The writers had it. They knew how to deploy it. The choice to do something harder and more careful was always available to them. What made the easier choice easier was the combination of factors we have been examining all evening: the volume demands of a show producing 20-plus episodes a year, the commercial logic of shock content as a reliable audience response generator, the absence of the creator's full engagement with the material in its middle and later years, the writing room culture that treated the equal offense defense as a sufficient answer to any criticism, and the simple grinding reality that doing things well takes more time and care than doing things quickly. The third thing to take away is about us, the audience. This show does not exist without us, and has not existed for 26 years without us. The relationship between a show and its viewers is not passive. Viewers shape what shows become. The jokes that generated the most response were the jokes that got repeated. The characters that the audience loved received more screen time. The material that turned advertisers' stomachs got suppressed. All of this is a feedback loop in which the audience participates, even when that participation does not feel like what it is. The appropriate response to looking honestly at the full record of Family Guy is not to stop watching it. It is not to retroactively transform your relationship to the early seasons into something ashamed and burdened. The early seasons were genuinely great, and that greatness is real, and it belongs to the audience that experienced it as great. The love people have for those seasons, the specific humor, the specific warmth, the specific inventiveness of watching something doing things television had not done before, that love is legitimate. It does not require defending by pretending the rest of the record does not exist. What it does require is the kind of honest witness we have been trying to practice tonight. Seeing the full record. Acknowledging what the jokes were built on, what they required of the audience, who was inside the laugh and who was outside it, who was invited to find it funny and who was invited to be the subject of the finding funny. Not as an accusation against anyone who enjoyed the show. As an act of attention that the show's 26-year history genuinely deserves. Family Guy mattered. It still matters as a document of a specific era's ideas about what comedy could be and what it was allowed to do. It matters as a record of creative ambition and creative failure that often inhabited the same episode. It matters as evidence that the most interesting thing about a long-running cultural artifact is usually not whether it was good or bad, but how it navigated the space between those poles across time, and what that navigation reveals about the culture that produced and consumed it. What we do with that evidence, how we carry it, how it shapes the way we watch and think and laugh, is the ongoing work. There is no clean ending to it. The show is still making episodes. The archive is still available. The record is still being made. But sitting with it honestly, the way we have tried to do tonight, is itself something worth doing. For the show, for the people it affected, for ourselves. Take a slow breath. Let the weight of it settle wherever it needs to settle. Thank you for being here, through all of it. If this kind of deep, careful, unhurried look at something that genuinely deserves it is the content you want more of, please subscribe. It makes an enormous difference to this channel's ability to keep making this kind of work. And leave a comment telling me what landed for you tonight, what you are still sitting with, what you want to explore further. These conversations matter. The ones you start in the comments become the direction this channel goes next. Rest well wherever you are. Family Guy premiered on Fox on the 31st of January 1999, directly following Super Bowl 33. That is one of the most valuable time slots in American broadcasting, and the show drew approximately 22 million viewers for its debut. For context, that is a staggering number for an animated series from a first-time showrunner. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when the pilot aired. He had been working on animated shows at Hanna-Barbera, working on projects like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory, before developing two short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve that Fox saw and bought the concept from. The show came fast. It was built fast, and the speed of its construction is part of why the foundational assumptions embedded in it never got the kind of thorough examination they deserved. The show's revival is itself a remarkable story. After its third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. The ratings had never been spectacular, partly because Fox kept shuffling the show between time slots without giving the audience time to find it. It aired against Frasier one year and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire another, and in both cases, the ratings suffered. Fox canceled it and moved on. Then something unexpected happened. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air reruns on their Adult Swim block for almost nothing, because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim in April 2003 and immediately became the highest-rated programming on the entire block, boosting Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. At the same time, the DVD sets for seasons 1 and 2 came out and sold over 400,000 copies. Fox paid attention. By 2004, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice was ordering new episodes. The show returned for a fourth season in May 2005 and was a major event, part of a Sunday night animation domination lineup alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and MacFarlane's new show American Dad. The revival is where the show's character started shifting in ways that matter for everything we are discussing tonight. The 3-year gap between cancellation and revival scattered the writing staff. When you cancel a show, the writers move on. They find new jobs. They start new projects. They cannot sit around for 3 years waiting for a show that might never come back. So, when the show returned, it was not the same writer's room that had produced those beloved first 3 seasons. New writers came in, different sensibilities entered the mix. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this in interviews, noting that one consequence of the show constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to restaff, and that this affected the tone. The heart that held the early show together began to thin out. The characters started to change in ways that would only become more extreme as the seasons went on. Understanding the revival context is important for understanding why the problematic material we are examining tonight tends to escalate after season 4. The early seasons set the foundation. The revival amplified everything in that foundation, the good and the bad parts of the foundation got amplified further and faster because the new writing staff did not have the same relationship to the characters, the same sense of what was essential about them and what was gratuitous. It is also worth spending a moment on the specific economic incentives that shape what gets written in a television writer's room, because those incentives are part of the story of how and why Family Guy's most problematic habits developed and persisted. Television writing is, at its core, a production process operating under significant time pressure. A show producing 22 episodes per season, which Family Guy did for most of its run, is producing roughly 1 episode every week and a half when you account for the full production cycle. That is an enormous rate of output, and at that rate, the premium is on material that can be generated quickly and reliably, material that can fill the page fast and get approved fast and move through production fast. Shock content, transgressive content, stereotypes, and caricature, all of these are fast. They require less work than jokes built on genuine character insight, less work than comedy that earns its laughs through careful structural architecture, less work than material that says something true and specific about human experience. A cutaway that simply depicts a racial stereotype is faster to write than a cutaway that uses the audience's expectations about a racial stereotype to subvert those expectations and say something genuinely interesting. The first one goes in the script quickly. The second one requires thought and revision, and the willingness to throw away a version that does not quite work and try again. When you are producing 22 episodes a year, the pressure to go fast is relentless and real. And the audience's response to shock content, which is immediate and strong and measurable in laugh tracks and ratings, reinforces the instinct to use it. The feedback loop of shock content, generating a strong audience response, generating more shock content, is one of the clearest patterns in Family Guy's creative history, and it is a pattern that economic incentives helped produce and perpetuate. There is also the question of what academic comedy writers and comedy scholars call the butt of the joke problem in relation to power dynamics. The butt of the joke is not just a static entity. It shifts depending on who is watching. A joke about a powerful group lands differently when watched by a member of that group than when watched by someone outside it. A joke about a marginalized group lands differently when watched by a member of that group than when watched by someone in the dominant culture who experiences the group's marginalization primarily as an abstraction. When Family Guy writes a joke in which a racial or ethnic stereotype is the punchline, the people in the writer's room experiencing the joke are predominantly people for whom that group's experience is an abstraction. The joke feels funny from where they are sitting. The people for whom it is not an abstraction are not in the room. This is not a problem unique to Family Guy. It is a problem endemic to creative industries that have historically been less diverse than the societies they produce content for. The writer's room reflects the composition of the people who get hired to be in writer's rooms, and for most of television history, that composition has been predominantly white, predominantly male, and predominantly drawing from a narrow set of social and educational backgrounds. The jokes that get written and the jokes that get cut reflect who is in the room. There is a specific episode from the first season that deserves examination on its own terms as a window into how the show handled religion and cultural identity from the very beginning. In the episode Holy Crap, which aired in season 1, Peter's deeply devout Catholic father Francis comes to stay with the family. The comedy centers on the conflict between Francis's rigid religious observance and the chaotic Griffin household. The episode includes several jokes at the expense of Catholicism and Catholic religious practice that are built on the premise that Catholic religiosity is inherently ridiculous, performative, and incompatible with normal family life. The Catholic jokes in this episode are fairly gentle by Family Guy standards, built more on exaggeration than on genuine cruelty. But the episode was still pulled from Fox's schedule after airing, reportedly due to concerns about its religious content and complaints from Catholic groups. This is the show's very first encounter with the kind of religious controversy that would follow it throughout its history, and it tells you something about how the show positioned itself from the beginning. As a show that considered all religious expression fair game for mockery, and that treated complaints from religious communities as evidence of the community's inability to take a joke, rather than as feedback worth considering. The show's relationship with Jewish humor in the early seasons is particularly complex and deserves more attention than it usually gets. The writers' room included a significant number of Jewish writers, which MacFarlane and others cited regularly as a defense of the show's Jewish jokes. The argument was that Jewish humor about Jewish people, made by Jewish people in the room, is categorically different from anti-Semitic humor, and there is a real version of this argument that has genuine merit. Jewish comedy about Jewish experience, coming from inside the tradition and the community, has a long and rich history that operates on entirely different terms from the same material produced from outside. But Family Guy's Jewish humor exists in a space that complicates this defense. The show is not a Jewish comedy. It is not produced primarily for a Jewish audience. It is a mainstream network animated comedy with an enormous and diverse audience that includes people with no cultural familiarity with the tradition of Jewish self-deprecating humor and no way of locating the show's Jewish jokes. Within that tradition, when those viewers watch Family Guy make a joke about Jewish people and money, they do not receive it as a piece of insider comedy from a community with the standing to make such jokes. They receive it as a joke about Jewish people and money. Full stop. The intentions of the Jewish writers in the room do not travel with the joke as it moves out into the world. This is the fundamental limitation of the "we have people in the room who belong to the group" defense as applied to mainstream broadcast comedy. The fact that the joke was made by people with standing to make it does not control how it is received by the enormously varied audience watching it. The intentions of the creators exist in one place. The effects of the material exist in an entirely different and much larger place. The Kennedy PEZ joke that MacFarlane later expressed regret over reveals something interesting about the specific moral geography of the early show. The Kennedy brothers were assassinated in 1963 and 1968 respectively. By 1999, 31 to 36 years had passed. The events were historical rather than recent for most of the audience. MacFarlane's subsequent regret over the joke, his sense that it had gone too far, suggests that he had a felt threshold somewhere. In the territory of historical political murders are too serious to be punchlines, this is a legitimate and reasonable threshold to have. What is interesting is that the same felt threshold apparently did not fire for the Holocaust joke from the same season, despite the Holocaust being a historical atrocity of considerably greater scale, and despite the fact that Holocaust survivors were a living population in 1,999 inches, a way that witnesses to the Kennedy assassinations were not. The inconsistency tells you something about which catastrophes felt close enough to the writers to generate protective instincts and which did not. The show's treatment of Black cultural markers in general, beyond just the Cleveland character, deserves examination as a pattern rather than as a collection of individual moments. Across the show's run, Black cultural expression, Black speech patterns, Black music, and Black cultural practices are used repeatedly as sources of humor in ways that do not extend the same treatment to white cultural markers. White American cultural expressions are the show's baseline, the unmarked norm against which other cultural expressions are positioned as deviation or difference. When Black characters speak in ways that the show codes as stereotypically Black, the coding itself is often part of the joke. When white characters behave in ways stereotypically associated with white American culture, the behavior is simply background. This asymmetry in how different cultural expressions are marked and unmarked is one of the fundamental mechanisms through which racial humor reinforces rather than undermines racial hierarchy, even when the people making the jokes have no conscious intention to do so. The show also has a specific and recurring habit of using racial violence, historical racial violence in particular, as a source of rapid throwaway jokes and cutaways. These are moments where the brutality of American racial history is deployed as setup material for quick comedy that depends on the audience having enough familiarity with the historical horror to get the reference, but not enough emotional investment in it to find the joke disturbing. These moments are, by definition, impossible to make across all audiences simultaneously. For viewers whose families carry direct intergenerational memory of that violence, the jokes land in a completely different register than they do for viewers for whom the same history is purely academic. The equal opportunity offense-defense provides no cover here, because the same joke does not land equally for all viewers. The audience's lived relationship to the material is part of how the joke functions. There is also the question of how the show handles the intersection of race and disability. Disability jokes appear throughout Family Guy's run, and they frequently rely on racial assumptions. Characters are depicted as disabled in ways that draw on racial stereotypes about cognitive capacity. The character of Joe Swanson, who uses a wheelchair, is treated in ways that combine jokes about his disability with broader patterns of how the show treats characters who are positioned as other to the show's normative center. Joe's arc across the show's history mirrors Meg's in certain ways. Initially established as a figure the other characters genuinely respect and in some cases envy, he gradually becomes someone the show feels comfortable mocking rather than simply depicting. The specific combination of his disability and his gradual positioning as the butt of jokes rather than a character with full human dignity is a pattern worth tracking. What makes the racial humor in Family Guy particularly frustrating and particularly worth sitting with is that the show has demonstrated it is capable of something better. There are specific episodes and specific moments across the show's history where the comedy about race is genuinely sharp, where it uses the audience's assumptions in ways that illuminate something rather than simply confirming something. The early seasons in particular contain moments where racial dynamics are handled with craft and genuine wit. The decline of that craft in later seasons, replaced increasingly by lazy caricature and quick stereotype, was not inevitable. It was a choice. Understanding it as a choice is important because it locates the responsibility where it actually belongs, with the people in the room making the decisions, and with the creative and economic environment that made the lazy choice easier than the careful one. The specific dynamic between Quagmire and Brian deserves its own examination here because it is one of the most revealing relationships in the show's later seasons, and it illuminates something important about how the show tried to manage the Quagmire problem without actually solving it. Beginning in Season 8, with the episode Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers what became one of the most famous monologues in the show's history. He tells Brian, in exhaustive and specific detail, exactly why he despises him. He calls Brian a fraud who pretends to be an intellectual but accomplishes nothing. He calls him a bad father who abandoned his own son. He calls him out for constantly hitting on Lois in front of her husband, one of his best friends. He calls him a hypocrite who claims moral superiority while consistently behaving worse than almost everyone around him. The speech is devastating, and it is entirely accurate. Everything Quagmire says is backed up by things the show has actually depicted. The audience was clearly meant to side with Quagmire in this moment. The writers knew that Brian had become insufferable, and they were letting Quagmire say everything the viewers were thinking. What is interesting about this moment, in the context of our discussion of Quagmire's own character, is the implicit moral positioning. The speech positions Quagmire as the one withstanding to call out Brian's moral failures. Quagmire, the character whose own moral failures include drugging women and keeping them captive, is positioned as a credible, moral authority relative to Brian. This is not a mistake in the writing, exactly. The speech works because Brian's specific failures are real and Quagmire's critique of them is accurate. But it does something interesting to the audience's relationship to Quagmire. It gives him a moral function in the show that distracts from examining his own moral status. He becomes the person who calls out the show's most self-righteous character, and that function earns him a kind of audience goodwill that makes it easier to ignore the darker dimensions of his characterization. The show was, perhaps unconsciously, managing the audience's discomfort with Quagmire by giving him a role as Brian's nemesis, a role that generated audience satisfaction in ways that insulated the character from the scrutiny he might otherwise have received. After the speech, the Quagmire-Brian feud becomes a recurring storyline that takes up increasing amounts of screen time in the later seasons. And in many of these feud episodes, Quagmire's behavior is actually worse than Brian's. He sabotages Brian's relationships. He scams him financially. He physically harms him on multiple occasions. The feud, which began as a vehicle for legitimate critique of Brian's character, gradually transforms into a platform for Quagmire to exhibit the same qualities he criticized Brian for having. The irony is not lost on critics who have analyzed these episodes carefully, but it seems to have been lost on the writers, or they saw it and considered it acceptable. Either way, the result is a recurring storyline that generates entertainment through escalating mutual cruelty rather than through anything that could be called genuine character development. The Me Too episode from Season 18, the episode Apple announced at Comic-Con, aired in 2019. In it, Quagmire is accused of sexual misconduct by a coworker. He initially denies it, then is confronted with video evidence, then goes through a kind of reckoning. The episode is not entirely successful by most critical assessments. It tries to take the subject seriously while still being a Family Guy episode, which is a difficult needle to thread. But its existence is meaningful as evidence that the writers understood, by 2019, that the accumulated weight of Quagmire's characterization had become a problem that required direct address. The episode functions as an apology of sorts, or at least as an acknowledgement. It does not undo 2 decades of the opposite. Nothing could undo 2 decades of the opposite, but it is an acknowledgement, and acknowledgements matter as evidence of what the people making the show actually understood about what they had been doing. The specific mechanics of how Meg's treatment escalated through the seasons is worth tracing in detail, because the escalation was not random. It followed a logic that reveals something about how creative decisions compound over time in a long-running show. In the first 3 seasons, the jokes about Meg are mild and relatively consistent with the show's overall comedic approach. She is boring. She is unpopular at school. She is the least interesting member of an extraordinary family. These are gentle and relatively affectionate depictions of adolescent ordinariness, and they occasionally generate genuine sympathy for the character rather than contempt. When Meg is turned down for a date in the early seasons, the scene generates a kind of mild compassion. When kids at school ignore her, the scene is recognizable to anyone who has experienced the social anxieties of high school. The shift begins in Season 4 after the revival, and it begins not with a single dramatic decision but with a series of small escalations, each of which seemed, in isolation, like just another joke. The first wave was the jokes about Meg's physical appearance. Characters began explicitly commenting on her as unattractive. This was new. The early season version of Meg was not presented as ugly. She was just ordinary. The post-revival version was presented as actively repellent, and the show built this presentation through repetition. The more characters commented on it, the more the audience's perception of the character was shaped by those comments, until the idea of Meg as physically undesirable became a background assumption that the show could activate at any time without needing to establish it. The second wave was the physical abuse. Peter began harassing Meg in ways that went beyond inattentive fathering into something more explicitly cruel. The fart-in-face gag is an emblematic example. It is not just insensitive, it is deliberately demeaning, an act of contempt performed for its own sake. The show used this kind of material because it generated a strong audience response. The combination of the gross-out element, the father-daughter dynamic, and the escalating absurdity of the abuse produced laughs from the audience, and those laughs reinforced the behavior in the writer's room. The feedback loop was simple and direct. Abuse of Meg worked, so there was more abuse of Meg. The third wave was the existential contempt. By the middle seasons, the abuse was no longer episodic. It was the show's constant background position toward the character. Meg did not need to do anything to deserve abuse. Her existence was sufficient. This is a specific and meaningful escalation from the earlier versions of the jokes, which at least theoretically had some connection to her behavior or her situation. By seasons 10 through 14, Meg being abused was not the consequence of anything. It was just what the show did with Meg. The fourth wave, which is in some ways the most troubling because it is the most structurally embedded, is the show's use of Meg's suffering as the family's emotional infrastructure. The seahorse seashell party thesis, that Meg functions as a lightning rod for the family's dysfunction, is presented as an insight about how the family works, but it is also a formal statement by the show about what Meg is for in narrative terms. She is a mechanism. She is there to absorb the story's negative energy so that the story can function. She is not a character with her own desires and trajectory and interiority. She is a structural element. Understanding her that way makes it much easier to treat her with the kind of sustained contempt the show actually did treat her with, because when a character is understood as a mechanism rather than a person, there are no limits on what you can do to them. The show's occasional reversals of this treatment, the episodes where Meg is written with genuine humanity and the comedy comes from her actual interiority, are worth acknowledging here. In The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13, Meg meets Lisa Simpson and the two of them develop a genuine friendship. Lisa encourages Meg, helps her find a talent, treats her as a full person. The episode is warm and well-crafted and shows clearly that the writers knew how to write Meg well when they chose to. In the season 14 episode, Peter's Sister, the show actually tries to explain the cycle of abuse by revealing that Peter was himself abused by his sister, and the episode gives both Peter and Meg genuine emotional moments of recognition and reconciliation. These episodes are evidence that the capacity for something better was always there, which makes the decade of something worse feel like less of an accident and more of a choice. The show's treatment of disability more broadly, across many different characters and many different episodes, follows patterns that are worth examining as a system rather than as isolated incidents. Joe Swanson, the Griffin family's police officer neighbor who uses a wheelchair, was introduced in the season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door as a figure the entire neighborhood admires. Peter is jealous of Joe when he first appears because Joe is competent, capable, respected, and popular despite his disability. The comedy in the early Joe episodes comes from Peter's jealousy and his recognition that Joe has qualities he lacks. This is a relatively respectful depiction of disability, one in which the disabled character's disability does not define his value, and in which the non-disabled character's attitude toward the disabled character is the thing the show is examining. Over the seasons, this relationship inverts almost entirely. Joe goes from being the figure everyone admires to being the figure everyone mocks. His disability transitions from being simply a part of who he is, one characteristic among many in a full human being, to being the primary source of jokes about him. The paralysis jokes multiply. The wife falling out of love with him storyline, which runs across multiple seasons, positions Joe's disability as the cause of his wife Bonnie's loss of attraction, a framing with troubling implications about the desirability of disabled people that the show never examines critically. By the middle and later seasons, Joe is a dramatically diminished character from the one introduced in season 1, diminished precisely through the process of his disability being converted from a background fact into a foreground punchline. The treatment of Joe parallels the treatment of Cleveland and the treatment of Meg in a way that forms a coherent pattern. The show started with characters who were positioned respectfully, with full human dignity, and progressively stripped that dignity from them as the show's appetite for contemptuous comedy grew. The targets of that contemptuous comedy were consistently people who were already in some sense vulnerable or marginalized within the show's universe. The black character, the disabled character, the teenage girl nobody pays attention to, the white male characters at the center of the show, Peter and Brian, and to some extent Quagmire, are protected from this kind of stripping. Their flaws are made worse over time too, but in ways that generate different kinds of comedy of excess rather than comedy of contempt. There is also the recurring use of mental illness and psychiatric conditions as sources of quick jokes that aged in specific and predictable ways. The show has a habit of deploying mental illness signifiers as shorthand for absurdity or comedy, which carries the implicit message that mental illness is inherently funny rather than a dimension of human experience that deserves the same care and consideration as physical illness. These jokes have aged in the same direction as the disability jokes generally. As public understanding of mental health has deepened, and as the stigma around mental health has imperfectly and incompletely reduced, the framing of mental illness as inherently comedic material has become increasingly difficult to look at without registering what it communicates about how the show valued the experiences of people living with those conditions. The history of how American broadcast entertainment has handled LGBTQ characters and LGBTQ themes is itself a long and complicated story that provides important context for evaluating Family Guy's specific failures. Throughout most of the 20th century, gay and lesbian characters were essentially absent from mainstream American television, or present only in coded forms that allowed the audience to read them as gay while maintaining plausible deniability for the network. When explicitly gay characters did begin appearing in mainstream television in the 1990s, they were frequently used as comic relief, positioned as safe objects of gentle mockery rather than as full characters with their own interiority and their own dramatic stakes. Family Guy emerged into this environment and both reflected it and pushed against it in complicated ways. On one hand, the show included gay characters and gay themes more frequently and more openly than many of its contemporaries. On the other hand, the way it included them was frequently built on the same caricature and the same comedic positioning as the less sophisticated treatments it was ostensibly moving beyond. The show could claim credit for visibility while simultaneously providing a form of visibility that did more to reinforce stereotypes than to challenge them. The specific treatment of Stewie Griffin is worth examining here, because Stewie's characterization across the show's history is itself a window into the show's discomfort with LGBTQ identity and its evolving and inconsistent approach to it. Stewie's sexuality was implicitly gay from very early in the show's run, built into his character through a series of jokes and mannerisms that consistently coded him as attracted to men. The show treated this as a running joke for many seasons, something to be hinted at and winked at, and occasionally stated outright and then walked back. By the later seasons, the hints had become explicit statements, and the explicit statements had become storylines. The season 16 episode that aired just before the show, pledged to phase out gay jokes, involved Stewie visiting a therapist and genuinely exploring his sexual identity. This episode received significant criticism from LGBTQ advocates who found its treatment of Stewie's sexuality both clumsy and offensive. The episode aired in 2018. One season later, the showrunners announced they were phasing out gay jokes. The sequence is striking. The show produced a gay-themed episode that was widely criticized for being offensive, and then announced it was phasing out the material that generated the criticism, without any formal engagement with what specifically had been wrong with the material or what a better approach would look like. This is the broader pattern of the show's engagement with LGBTQ identity across its history: reactive rather than reflective, moving in response to criticism rather than in response to a developed understanding of what was being done wrong. The acknowledgments come after the harm. The commitments to change arrive after the episodes that required changing. And then the commitments prove difficult to sustain because they were not grounded in a genuine reckoning with the principles at stake, only in a pragmatic response to the specific criticism at hand. The FCC complaint history of Family Guy is itself a rich document of the broadcast standards system in action, and it is worth examining in some detail because it illuminates the specific and idiosyncratic logic of what gets flagged and what does not. The Parents Television Council, a conservative advocacy group, has placed Family Guy on its Worst TV Show of the Week list on over 40 separate occasions. It has filed numerous formal complaints with the FCC about specific episodes and specific content. The FCC has received multiple petitions asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting. Some of these complaints generated formal FCC inquiries. None of them resulted in the kind of enforcement action that would have affected the show's ability to air. The content that generated PTC complaints ranged widely: graphic violence, sexual content, religious mockery, references to drug use, jokes about sexual assault, and the general tone of the show's humor. The FCC's standard for what constitutes actionable indecency on broadcast television involves a specific legal test related to sexual or excretory content of a patently offensive nature. Most of the content the PTC complained about did not meet this specific legal test, which is why the complaints did not generate enforcement action. The FCC's indecency standard is a very specific and narrow legal category, not a general test of whether content causes harm. This gap between the legal indecency standard and the broader category of harmful content is one of the clearest illustrations of why the broadcast standards system cannot function as an adequate protection against the kinds of harm we have been discussing tonight. The system was designed to prevent one specific kind of harm, namely explicit sexual content and explicit bathroom content on broadcast television where children might be watching. It was not designed to address stereotype, caricature, the normalization of sexual violence, or the systematic dehumanization of specific groups through sustained comedic contempt. Those things are entirely outside the FCC's legal purview. The practical result is a system in which a network can air a character who is explicitly a pedophile for 20-plus seasons and face no legal consequences, while a flash of nudity on a primetime broadcast can generate massive FCC fines. The asymmetry is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as designed. The design reflects a specific set of priorities about what kinds of harm the broadcast system is designed to prevent, and those priorities were not set with the communities most harmed by stereotyping and dehumanization in mind. The partial terms of endearment situation is worth returning to in this context. The episode was produced in 2009 and refused by Fox for broadcast. It has never aired on American broadcast television. It has aired in the United Kingdom, Australia, the Netherlands, and various other countries. It is available on DVD and on streaming platforms in the United States. Any American who wants to watch it can watch it immediately by opening Hulu or Disney+. What Fox's refusal to air it accomplished, in practical terms, was nothing at all in terms of preventing American viewers from accessing it. What it accomplished in terms of the show's creative history was to create a data point. A thoughtful and carefully executed episode about abortion was too hot for Fox to broadcast, while years of content involving rape jokes and a recurring pedophile character sailed through without incident. The message this sends about institutional priorities, about what kinds of harm the broadcast system takes seriously and what kinds of harm it ignores, is impossible to miss. The relationship between the show's escalating shock content and its declining storytelling quality is worth examining as a causal relationship rather than just a correlation. When a show relies increasingly on shock and extremity as its primary comedy tools, the structural craft of storytelling tends to atrophy. Because shock content generates a reaction without requiring the careful architecture of a well-built joke, the incentive to develop and maintain that structural craft weakens. The writers get better at generating strong, immediate responses, and worse at building toward durable comedy. This is visible in the evolution of the cutaway gag from the early seasons to the later ones. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways are relatively brief, and are clearly in service of the episode's main story. A character references something, the show cuts to a quick visual illustration, the main story continues. The cutaway is a tool. By the middle seasons, the cutaways have grown longer, and have started to replace rather than supplement the story. By the later seasons, some episodes have so many cutaways that if you removed all of them, you would be left with perhaps 10 minutes of actual story in a 22-minute episode. The cutaways have become the show rather than being a feature of the show. The transition from cutaways as tool to cutaways as content reflects the broader shift from craft to reaction seeking. A cutaway in the early show had to be funny enough to justify the interruption to the story. A cutaway in the later show just had to be extreme enough or surprising enough to generate a response, because the story was thin enough that the cutaway was not interrupting anything that was going very far on its own anyway. The South Park 2-episode arc, Cartoon Wars, from 2006, which explicitly attacked Family Guy's writing style, depicted the show's jokes as being written by manatees randomly pushing idea balls together, suggesting that the comedy was completely random and required no skill. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, have been open about their disrespect for Family Guy's writing approach. What is interesting about Cartoon Wars as a cultural document is the timing. 2006 is right at the beginning of the period when Family Guy's shock content escalation became most pronounced. Parker and Stone were identifying the problem in real time, and subsequent seasons of Family Guy proceeded to demonstrate that their diagnosis was accurate. Parker and Stone reported receiving phone calls from writers on The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for making those episodes. This is notable because it suggests that people working in animated comedy at a professional level had noticed the same pattern the South Park creators were identifying. The criticism was coming from peers in the industry, not just from outside critics or offended advocacy groups. That the show continued in the same direction despite this criticism is evidence that the commercial logic of shock content was more powerful than the creative judgment of the people who understood what was being lost. The show's political humor deserves more extended examination than we have given it, because the patterns in how the show handles political material are themselves revealing in ways that go beyond the simple observation that topical jokes become dated. Family Guy has always positioned itself as politically liberal in a general way. Brian is the show's most explicitly political character, and his politics are consistently and explicitly progressive. He is an atheist. He supports progressive social policies. He makes his views known frequently and sometimes at significant length. The show's political humor, particularly in the middle and later seasons, tends to punch at conservative political figures and conservative political positions rather than at liberal ones. This is not inherently wrong, and it reflects the genuine political orientation of most of the show's writing staff. But it produces a specific kind of humor that ages in specific ways. Political humor that punches in a single direction is inherently dependent on the continued relevance and continued power of the target. When the specific political figures being mocked are no longer in office, no longer in the public conversation, no longer culturally present in ways that make them legible as targets, the humor loses its charge. The Bush-era political humor in Family Guy was genuinely funny to a large portion of the audience when it aired, both because Bush was in office and because the specific political frustrations the humor expressed were current and felt. Watch now, much of it reads as period-specific in ways that limit its effect. The feeling of righteous transgression that animated the humor has dissipated because the specific target of the transgression is no longer present. There is also the question of political humor and accuracy. Some of Family Guy's political jokes were genuinely accurate as commentary on the positions and behaviors of the political figures they targeted. Some were built more on caricature than on truth, taking shortcuts that generated laughs through exaggeration but sacrificed accuracy for the sake of the reaction. The jokes built on caricature aged faster than the jokes built on genuine observation, because caricature depends on shared assumptions about its target that shift as the cultural moment shifts, while genuine observation tends to contain something true that persists. The show's engagement with race in political contexts is worth noting specifically. Several episodes across the show's history use political events and political figures as opportunities for racial humor, combining the instability of topical comedy with the harm potential of racial caricature in ways that are doubly problematic. The specific political context becomes dated quickly, leaving the racial caricature without even the thin framework of contemporary relevance to partially justify it. The international dimensions of the show's political humor also aged in interesting ways. Family Guy was always primarily a domestic American comedy, written for and about American political culture. Its political humor assumed a shared American cultural and political context that it could rely on as a baseline. As the show's international audience grew, through syndication and eventually through streaming, that baseline became increasingly unavailable to large portions of its actual audience. The political humor that felt sharp and specific to American viewers often read as opaque or confusing to international viewers who did not share the specific cultural references the jokes required. The Venezuelan ban on 420 is an extreme example of this dynamic, but the broader pattern of American political humor landing differently in different national contexts runs through much of the show's topical content. There is one more dimension of Family Guy's creative history that we have not yet given adequate attention, and it is one that is particularly relevant to understanding how the show's problems developed and persisted over time. That is the question of Seth MacFarlane's own relationship to the show's direction in its middle and later years. MacFarlane stepped back from active creative involvement in Family Guy around 2011, handing over the day-to-day running of the show to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin as co-showrunners. He continued to voice the characters, which meant he was in the recording booth for every episode, listening to the material as it was performed. But the writing, the story planning, the creative oversight, all of that moved to other people. MacFarlane focused his energy on other projects. The film Ted in 2012, A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, the Orville television series beginning in 2017, and various other production endeavors. He signed a massive deal with NBC Universal in 2020, worth approximately $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company away from the Fox ecosystem entirely. In 2021, McFarlane publicly posted on social media that he wished Family Guy was on any other network than Fox, citing his discomfort with the network's connection to Fox News and its broader editorial direction. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. This was not a private frustration. It was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows, publicly saying he wanted out, on record, in a post anyone could read. The picture this paints is of a creator who had emotionally moved on from his creation well before he formally disengaged from it, who found himself in the uncomfortable position of being contractually tied to a network he publicly resented through a show he had once cared deeply about. In an April 2024 interview, McFarlane discussed the future of Family Guy and said he did not see a good reason to stop making it because people still loved it and it generated funding for causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He acknowledged there had been a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up, but said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going so long that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. There is something worth sitting with in that framing. The show's continued existence is justified primarily in terms of financial utility and audience demand. The creator does not describe exciting new stories he wants to tell or creative directions he is eager to explore. The show is continuing because it can, not because its creator has a burning creative vision for it. This is a very different energy from the McFarlane who pitched a 15-minute pilot in 1998 with genuine excitement and genuine ideas. Something changed, and the show's content in its later years reflects what changed. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons in what was described as a mega deal with parent company Disney. The renewal would take the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show is locked in for years into the future. Its continued existence is guaranteed by business logic, not by creative vision. There is nothing necessarily wrong with this as a business decision. Family Guy is cheap to produce relative to live-action television. It has massive value in reruns and on streaming platforms. It generates merchandise revenue. It is a recognizable global brand. All of these things are true and they all make financial sense. But they have nothing to do with whether the show is actually good or whether its continued production serves any creative or cultural purpose beyond the financial one. Family Guy has become a show that exists primarily because it is profitable. The audience that once loved it has significantly moved on, as the ratings demonstrate. The creator has emotionally moved on, as his public statements demonstrate. But the business machine keeps turning because the economics still work. This context matters for understanding the show's problematic content because it explains why the reform efforts, the phase-outs, the acknowledgments of wrongness have been so difficult to sustain. When a show is being made primarily because it is profitable, and when the creator is not driving the creative direction with genuine passion and genuine vision, the path of least resistance in the writer's room is going to prevail. The path of least resistance is shock content, quick stereotypes, the easily generated material that fills the page fast and generates the reliable reaction. The harder work of genuinely reckoning with the show's history and genuinely doing something different requires creative will that comes from somewhere, and the show's current institutional situation does not supply that will from the top. The show's legacy is ultimately one of genuine creative innovation coexisting with genuine and sustained harm. The cutaway format changed animation. The show's influence on subsequent adult animated comedy is real and permanent. The talent in the voice cast, the inventive animation in many specific sequences, the genuinely excellent episodes scattered throughout the show's long run. All of these are real. They belong to the record. But so does the rest of the record. The decade of abuse directed at Meg Griffin, the 20 years of Quagmire, the trans panic episode, the racial caricature, the equal offense defense deployed in service of material that was never equally careful. The institutional failures of the broadcast system that allowed harm to continue because the harm did not meet a specific legal threshold. All of it is the record. Sitting with the full record, holding both the genuine achievement and the genuine harm in view at the same time, without rushing to a verdict that tidies it up into something simpler than it is the work. It is the work that doing this kind of analysis requires. It is the work that a 26-year body of work, watched by hundreds of millions of people, and shaped by and shaping the culture it existed in, genuinely deserves. We have done some of that work tonight. There is more of it to do. There always is. If this kind of deep, careful, unhurried look at something that genuinely deserves it is the content you want more of, please subscribe. It makes an enormous difference to this channel's ability to keep making this kind of work. And leave a comment telling me what landed for you tonight, what you are still sitting with, what you want to explore further. These conversations matter. The ones you start in the comments become the direction this channel goes next. Rest well, wherever you are. Additional depth. The writer's room culture. To fully understand why Family Guy's most problematic patterns persisted for as long as they did, it is worth looking closely at the specific culture of the show's writer's room, because the writer's room is where all of these decisions were made, defended, challenged, and ultimately locked in as episodes. Television writers' rooms operate under a specific set of pressures and conventions that shape what gets written and what gets cut. The room is typically hierarchical. The showrunner and senior writers have the most authority over what goes in the script, and junior writers are expected to defer to that authority while gradually proving themselves. The humor of the room, the kinds of jokes that land when writers are pitching in a group setting, shapes what ends up on the page. Jokes that generate laughter in the room go into the script. Jokes that land flat do not. This means that the taste of the most influential people in the room has an outsized effect on the tone of the show. For most of Family Guy's history, the writer's room was overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. This is not unique to Family Guy. It was the norm across most of American television comedy for most of the 20th century, and it persisted in various forms well into the 21st. But it is relevant to the show's specific patterns because it means that the people whose laughter determined what went into the script were people for whom the specific experiences of racial minorities, women, and LGBTQ people were largely abstractions rather than lived realities. When a racial stereotype gets pitched in a room full of people who have no personal stake in that stereotype, and the room laughs, the joke goes in. When someone pushes back on the basis that the joke causes harm to a community, that pushback is one voice among many, and in a hierarchical room, it may not be the voice that wins. The documented shift in Meg Griffin's treatment following the addition of more women to the writing staff is the most concrete evidence we have that the room's composition affected its output in direct and traceable ways. When more women were in the room, the relentless abuse directed at the show's main female teenage character decreased. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct causal connection. The women in the room knew something about what it meant to be Meg Griffin that the men in the room were not feeling in the same way. And when those women had sufficient influence in the room, that knowledge affected the material. This does not mean that male writers cannot write female characters with empathy and intelligence. Obviously they can and they do. But it does mean that when a show has been engaged for a decade in a pattern of systematic contempt toward a female character, and when that pattern exists in a room that has been overwhelmingly male, the relationship between the room's composition and the room's output is worth examining rather than explaining away. The question of diverse representation in the writer's room is not just an issue of fairness or inclusion as an end in itself, though it is certainly that. It is also an issue of what kind of comedy gets made. When the people in the room are overwhelmingly drawn from one demographic group, the things they find funny tend to reflect the perspective and the assumptions of that group. The things they do not find funny tend to be things that would require them to hold another group's experience with genuine seriousness. And the things they use casually as punchline material tend to be things that are not their own experience, things that are safely other from their own lives in ways that allow them to be treated as comedy material without the writers ever having to confront what that treatment actually costs. The MacFarlane era of the show, roughly seasons 1 through 7 or 8, operated under a different dynamic than the post-MacFarlane era. Not just because MacFarlane was more creatively invested, but because the show was smaller and more closely held. When the show was entirely MacFarlane's creative project, his specific instincts and sensibilities functioned as a kind of coherence mechanism, both for better and for worse. The things he found funny went in. The things he did not find funny did not. His instincts produced some of the show's most inventive and genuinely funny material. His instincts also produced some of the show's most uncomfortable material. But at least it was coherent. When he stepped back, The room lost that coherence and replaced it with the collective taste of a larger group of writers with less personal investment in the specific vision of the show. Additional depth: the audience and what we absorb. One dimension of this conversation that we have touched on but not fully explored is the question of what audiences absorb from the media they consume and what the research actually says about the relationship between entertainment content and real-world attitudes and behaviors. This is an area where media researchers have produced substantial and sometimes contested findings across decades of work. The general consensus in the research literature is that media representations of various groups, sustained over time and presented without counter-narrative, do shape audience attitudes toward those groups. This is not a simple or mechanical relationship. It is not the case that watching a racial stereotype in a Family Guy cutaway directly causes someone to hold racist beliefs. The relationship is more diffuse and more complex than that. But the accumulated exposure to media representations that consistently frame certain groups in certain ways does, over time, contribute to the audience's background assumptions about those groups. The specific mechanism that researchers describe most frequently is called cultivation theory, developed by George Gerbner in the 1960s and 1970s. The basic idea is that heavy television viewers develop beliefs about the world that mirror the patterns and representations they see most frequently on television, rather than the patterns and representations of the actual world they live in. If television consistently shows a certain group in criminal roles, heavy viewers develop exaggerated estimates of that group's involvement in crime. If television consistently shows sexual violence as a source of comedy, heavy viewers may develop a correspondingly relaxed attitude towards sexual violence. Family Guy has been one of the most watched shows on American television for over 25 years. Its audience has included hundreds of millions of people at different stages of their lives and their cultural development. For many viewers, and particularly for younger viewers who were watching during their formative years, Family Guy was a significant part of the media environment that shaped their background assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, and disability. This does not mean that everyone who watched Family Guy developed harmful attitudes as a result. That would be an absurdly reductive claim, but it does mean that the show's content, repeated across hundreds of episodes and millions of viewers over many years, was contributing to a cultural environment in ways that are worth taking seriously. The jokes that generated laughs were also, simultaneously, teaching the audience something about what is available to be laughed at. The characters who were positioned as targets were also, simultaneously, teaching the audience something about who it is acceptable to target. The children who grew up watching Family Guy in the early 2000s are now adults. They are in workplaces. They are in positions of authority. They are forming families and raising children of their own. The background assumptions they formed during the years when they were watching this show are part of who they are now. This is not a claim about individual causation. It is a claim about cultural influence at a population level. And at a population level, the patterns we have examined tonight had real effects. There is also the specific question of what Family Guy communicated to viewers who belong to the groups being mocked. For those viewers, the experience of watching the show was qualitatively different from the experience of viewers who were laughing from a position of comfortable distance. For Asian viewers watching Trisha Takanawa, for trans viewers watching Quagmire's Dad, for viewers who had experienced sexual violence watching the Aquaman cutaway, for teenagers who recognized their own situation in Meg Griffin's storylines, the show was saying something specifically to them about how the culture understood their experience and their value. What it was saying in too many cases and for too long was, your experience is raw material for other people's entertainment. Your pain is a punchline. Your humanity is negotiable. These messages are not what the show intended to send. MacFarlane and the writing staff have, in various interviews over the years, expressed genuine belief that the show was more progressive than its critics gave it credit for, that it was satirizing intolerance rather than expressing it. But intention does not determine reception. The viewers who absorbed those messages did not receive a correction because the writer's intentions were good. They just received the messages. Additional depth: The Simpsons comparison and what it reveals. It is almost impossible to discuss Family Guy's creative history without discussing The Simpsons. both because the shows have been in explicit competition for most of their overlapping histories, and because the comparison illuminates something important about the choices Family Guy made and could have made differently. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989, nearly 10 years before Family Guy. It is the longest-running American primetime animated series in history, currently in its 36th season, and like Family Guy, it has a complicated aging story, including a period of creative decline that is one of the most extensively discussed in television criticism. But the nature of The Simpsons' aging is different from Family Guy's aging in ways that are revealing. The Simpsons' problematic material tends to exist in specific categories. The depiction of Apu Nahasapima, the Indian convenience store owner voiced by Hank Azaria, became the subject of major public discussion following the 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu, which examined how the character had functioned as a racial caricature affecting the real-world experiences of South Asian Americans. The Simpsons' political humor has aged in some of the same ways as Family Guy's, becoming dated as the specific political moment it was responding to receded. And some of the show's early dark humor has become uncomfortable to revisit. But The Simpsons did not produce anything comparable to Family Guy's decade-long systematic abuse of Meg Griffin. It did not produce anything comparable to Quagmire's 20 years of normalized sexual predation. Its racial caricature, while real and legitimately criticized, did not extend to the same pervasive use of every available ethnic stereotype as the primary comedic tool. The Simpsons' heart, the genuine affection between the Simpson family members, despite their dysfunction, was maintained across the show's long run in ways that Family Guy's parallel affection was not. This comparison matters because it undermines one of the most common defenses of Family Guy's specific failures. The defense that any show running for 25 years will have these kinds of problems, that the sheer duration makes a certain amount of harm inevitable. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years, and it has not done what Family Guy did with Meg Griffin. It has not done what Family Guy did with Quagmire. The longevity defense does not hold up when you compare the two shows directly. The comparison also highlights something about the specific creative decision to build shock and extremity into Family Guy's core identity in a way that The Simpsons never did. The Simpsons is, at its heart, a character comedy. The characters are what the show is about, and the writers have always understood that the characters have to be maintained, have to be protected from the kind of escalating degradation that makes them unrecognizable and unsympathetic. Homer Simpson has become dumber and more impulsive over the years, a process critics have called Simpsonization or Flanderization, but he has not become cruel in the way that Peter Griffin became cruel. He has not become someone whose behavior generates genuine discomfort rather than the comfortable laughs of recognizable stupidity. Family Guy chose differently. It chose to sacrifice character for shock. It chose to sacrifice warmth for edge. And those choices, which were made one at a time in individual episodes across many seasons, accumulated into the show we now have access to in its full archive. Understanding them as choices, rather than as the natural consequences of a long-running show, is the first step toward being able to evaluate them honestly. What actually makes something funny? There is a deeper question lurking underneath everything we have discussed tonight, and it is worth surfacing explicitly before we close. What actually makes something funny? Not funny to a specific audience in a specific moment, but funny in a way that holds up, funny in a way that adds something to the people laughing, funny in a way that justifies itself. The comedy that holds up the longest tends to be comedy that finds something true. Not just surprising, not just transgressive, not just extreme, true. True in the sense of recognizing something about human experience that the audience knows to be real but has not quite been able to articulate. This is the comedy that makes people laugh and simultaneously think. The comedy where the laugh arrives alongside an insight, where you are laughing because you have been shown something you recognized but had not quite seen before. The best moments in Family Guy, the moments that people still cite 20 years later as examples of the show at its peak, are moments of this kind. The Bird is the Word cutaway from Season 8 is genuinely funny, partly because of its absurd commitment and partly because it captures something true about how a piece of catchy pop culture can colonize your brain against your will. The Brian and Stewie bank vault episode is genuinely moving because it uses its limited setting to say something true about the specific quality of a friendship between two people who understand each other despite their differences. The early Peter-Brian dynamic at its best was funny because it captured something true about how intelligent, thoughtful people maintain loving friendships with people whose intelligence and thoughtfulness operate in completely different registers. These moments work because they are working towards something beyond the immediate reaction. They are trying to say something. They are using comedy as a vehicle for insight rather than as an end in itself. The comedy that ages worse tends to be comedy that was working only toward the immediate reaction. Comedy that got its laugh through transgression, through the shock of saying something that had not been said before, through the use of a stereotype that was legible and familiar, through the exploitation of someone's vulnerability. This comedy does not hold up because it never had anything underneath it. The surprise wore off. The transgression became familiar. The stereotype became invisible or became offensive. The vulnerability became real in a way that made laughing at it uncomfortable. And with the immediate reaction gone, there was nothing left. The ratio of the first kind of comedy to the second kind shifted across Family Guy's history in a direction that is now clearly visible in retrospect. The early seasons had more of the first kind. They had more moments of genuine insight alongside the transgression, more comedy that was trying to say something true even when it was also trying to shock. The later seasons had proportionally more of the second kind, more pure transgression, more stereotype as an end in itself, more exploitation of vulnerability without any corresponding insight. This is the thing that makes the early seasons feel different, even to viewers who cannot quite articulate why. The early seasons had more of something that the later seasons had less of. They were trying harder. They were reaching for something, not always successfully, and not always in ways that we can look at without wincing, but they were reaching. That reaching is visible in the material, and its absence in the later material is visible there too. Understanding what made the comedy work when it worked, and what made it stop working when it stopped, is ultimately more useful than any verdict about whether the show was good or bad. Because the question of what makes comedy genuinely good, genuinely durable, genuinely worth the time of the audience and the labor of the people making it, is a question that remains relevant regardless of what you think about Family Guy specifically. It is a question that shapes every piece of entertainment being made right now. And every answer that the show's history illuminates, every lesson visible in the contrast between what worked and what did not, is a piece of evidence in the ongoing conversation about what comedy is for and what it owes the people it reaches. Additional depth. The cutaway gag as an art form and its corruption. The cutaway gag, in its original and best form, is a genuinely interesting comedic innovation. It is worth spending some time understanding what it actually was before we discuss what it became, because the distance between those two things is one of the clearest measures of the show's creative decline. In its early incarnation, the cutaway gag worked on a principle of productive interruption. The main story would be proceeding along. A character would say something, and the show would cut to a visual illustration of that something that was funnier, weirder, or more extreme than the thing itself. The key was that the cutaway had a specific relationship to the moment that prompted it. The joke was generated by the gap between what the character said and what the cutaway showed, or by the specific absurdity of the particular illustration chosen, or by the way the cutaway reflected back something unexpected about the character who triggered it. In the very first season, the cutaways are quick, specific, and clearly generated by genuine comedy writers thinking hard about exactly the right way to illustrate a particular moment. When Peter makes a reference to having done something ridiculous, the cutaway does not just show something generically absurd. It shows the specific thing, rendered in a way that adds something to the joke rather than just repeating it. The best early cutaways feel inevitable in retrospect, like you could not have illustrated that line any other way, which is the sign of a good joke. It seems obvious once you hear it, but only someone genuinely skilled at this craft would have found it. What happened over time is that the cutaway became decoupled from the story in increasingly complete ways. In the middle seasons, cutaways began appearing that had only the loosest relationship to whatever had prompted them. A character would say something, and the show would cut to a sequence that seemed to have been written independently, stored in a kind of warehouse of cutaway gags, and attached to whatever line happened to need a cutaway that week. The specific comedy of the gap between the prompt and the response disappeared, because the prompt and the response were no longer genuinely connected. By the later seasons, some cutaways function essentially as standalone sketches, complete pieces of comedy that happen to be inserted into a Family Guy episode, but that could have been inserted almost anywhere. The Conway Twitty gags are the extreme version of this, but the principle applies to many of the longer cutaways from seasons 10 through 23. They are not in conversation with the story. They are not even in conversation with the character who triggered them. They are just things that the writers thought were funny, dropped into the show because the format accommodated them. This matters for everything we have discussed tonight, because the decoupling of the cutaway from the story is also a decoupling of the comedy from consequence. When a cutaway is genuinely connected to the story and the character, it has to be accountable to that story and character. The character's worldview, their specific humanity, the context of what they are doing and why, all of this constrains what the cutaway can be and still function as comedy rather than as chaos. When the cutaway is completely free-floating, none of those constraints apply. The cutaway can go anywhere and do anything, including things that would never be acceptable within the story's own logic. This is part of why the racial stereotypes in Family Guy's cutaways are so persistent and so resistant to reform. Within the story, the show occasionally makes gestures toward treating minority characters with dignity. Within the story's logic, crude racial caricature would be obviously wrong, but the cutaway format creates a space that is partially outside the story's logic, a space where different rules apply, where the show can deploy material that would be awkward within the story itself. The cutaway became a permission structure for content that the story could not have accommodated, and the harmful content that found its home in the cutaway format persisted longer precisely because of that structural freedom. Additional depth: the network context and Fox's role. Fox Broadcasting Company has played a specific and underappreciated role in the shape of Family Guy's content across its history, and that role deserves direct examination because it shaped what the show became in ways that are not entirely attributable to the creators alone. Fox, as a broadcast network, has always occupied a specific market position relative to its competitors. It launched in 1986 as the fourth American broadcast network, competing against ABC, NBC, and CBS, all of which had decades of established programming and established audience relationships. Fox differentiated itself through content that was edgier, more provocative, and more willing to court controversy than its competitors. Shows like Married with Children, In Living Color, and The Simpsons established Fox as the network that would go places the other networks would not, and that positioning became a core part of the Fox brand. Family Guy fit this positioning perfectly, a show that made jokes about everything, that refused to respect the conventions of polite entertainment, that actively sought controversy as a form of marketing, was exactly the kind of content that reinforced Fox's brand identity. And Fox, for its part, used the show's controversies productively. The episodes that generated complaints from the Parents Television Council, the episodes that generated FCC petitions, the episodes that got written about in news articles, all of these generated free publicity. They kept the show in the public conversation in ways that pure quality reviews could not sustain across 26 seasons. This created a perverse incentive structure in which controversy was commercially valuable to the network and therefore implicitly encouraged by the network's overall positioning. When Family Guy got in trouble for a specific piece of content, the network's response was rarely to examine whether the content had been genuinely harmful. It was usually to assess whether the trouble had been commercially net positive or net negative. If the controversy generated more views and more attention than it cost in advertiser withdrawals, it was probably acceptable to continue. If it cost more than it generated, it was probably worth addressing. The specific decisions about what to suppress and what to air, which we discussed in the section on banned episodes, reflect this commercial calculus rather than any coherent ethical framework. The "when you wish upon a Weinstein suppression" was commercially motivated. Fox anticipated the anti-Semitism controversy would cost more than it generated and suppressed the episode accordingly. The partial terms of endearment suppression was commercially motivated. Abortion controversy was a guaranteed advertiser problem, and Fox declined to take it on. The years of rape jokes, racial caricature, and trans mockery that sailed through without suppression, those were assessed as commercially acceptable, meaning the controversy they generated was either net positive or insufficiently organized to cost the network anything meaningful. Understanding this context does not exonerate the creators. The choices that were made in the writer's room were the creators' choices, but it does complicate the picture. The show existed within an institutional context that was actively indifferent to harm that did not translate into commercial cost, and in some cases actively incentivized controversy that generated commercial benefit regardless of its harm. The creators were making choices within that context, shaped by that context, and to some extent rewarded by that context for exactly the kinds of choices we have been examining tonight. Additional depth: what 26 years in the culture actually means. Family Guy has been part of the cultural landscape for 26 years. That is a long time for any piece of entertainment to persist, and the sheer duration of its presence in the culture is itself worth sitting with. For context, a child who was 10 years old when Family Guy premiered in 1999 is 36 now. That person has potentially had Family Guy as a presence in their cultural environment for their entire adult life. The jokes they laughed at 12 were forming their understanding of what comedy was and what it was allowed to do. The characters they watched at 15 were contributing to their background assumptions about how different kinds of people are treated and how different kinds of people are valued. The show that was on in their house every Sunday night was shaping the cultural atmosphere they were growing up in, one episode at a time, for decades. This is the cumulative effect argument, and it matters more than any individual bad episode or any individual bad joke. No single joke in Family Guy's archive made anyone a racist or made anyone more comfortable with sexual violence. The effect is not that direct or that mechanical. The effect is more diffuse. A sustained presence in the cultural environment, establishing certain things as normal and available and funny, working quietly on the background assumptions that people bring to the world. The show was also remarkably effective at shaping the vocabulary of popular humor in ways that extended well beyond its own audience. The cutaway format that Family Guy popularized influenced the structure of comedy on the internet, particularly on platforms like YouTube and Vine and TikTok, where short, self-contained comedic videos became the dominant form. The "this is worse than that time" setup that Family Guy used to trigger cutaways became a widely replicated template for online comedy. The show's humor spread beyond its direct audience into the broader comedic vocabulary, which means its influence on how people think about comedy and what comedy is allowed to do extended even further than its direct viewership. This broader influence makes the question of what the show was doing and what it was saying more rather than less important. When a cultural object shapes not just its direct audience but the vocabulary and assumptions of a much larger cultural community, the responsibility attached to that influence grows accordingly. Family Guy was not just entertaining 22 million people on a Sunday night. It was contributing to the cultural environment in which comedy was understood and produced and consumed by a much larger group of people who had absorbed its influence, even if they had never watched a full episode. The specific vocabulary that Family Guy contributed to popular culture includes some genuinely enriching things. It includes creative forms and comedic approaches that opened up possibilities for other creators. It also includes some things that were less enriching: a normalized language of contempt towards certain categories of people, a comfortable distance from which certain kinds of human suffering could be treated as entertainment, an implicit permission structure for humor that treated other people's vulnerability as raw material. Both of these things are the legacy. They exist together. And the work of sitting with a cultural legacy honestly, without collapsing it into either pure celebration or pure condemnation, is exactly the kind of work that 26 years of significant cultural presence demands. Additional depth: comparing American Dad and what it proves. Perhaps the most quietly damning piece of evidence in the entire story of Family Guy's creative choices is the existence and trajectory of American Dad, the show Seth MacFarlane created alongside Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman that premiered in February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned from cancellation for its fourth season. American Dad was dismissed almost immediately upon arrival. Critics called it a Family Guy knockoff. Audiences watched it because it aired on the same night as Family Guy, not because they were specifically seeking it out. For its first couple of seasons, the dismissal was arguably fair. The show was finding its footing. leaning too heavily on the political satire of its central character Stan Smith's extreme conservatism, struggling to develop the other characters beyond their initial archetypes. Then something happened that nobody had predicted. American Dad got genuinely, measurably, consistently better, while Family Guy got worse. Not slightly better in one dimension, while declining in another. Better across every significant metric: character development, storytelling, emotional range, comedic craft, and the durability of its specific humor. By the time you reach seasons 5 through 8 of American Dad, you are watching a show that is operating at a genuinely high level of comedy writing, building on character relationships, and accumulated history to generate laughs that come from somewhere real rather than from shock and transgression. The key structural difference between the two shows, the one that helps explain their diverging trajectories, is that American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This is not a minor stylistic choice. It is a fundamental decision about what kind of comedy the show is making. Without cutaways to fall back on, the American Dad writers had to make every episode work as an actual story. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situation they were in. The comedy had to be earned through plot rather than inserted through format. This forced the writing staff to develop genuine storytelling skills, to think carefully about character consistency and character development, to build toward emotional payoffs that required setup across the whole episode rather than being delivered in standalone 30-second packages. The discipline of the no-cutaway format made American Dad writers better at the fundamental craft of comedy writing in ways that Family Guy writers, operating in a format that was far more forgiving of structural weakness, never had to be. The characters on American Dad also avoided the Flanderization that destroyed the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature and gradually became a complex character who was stubborn and often wrong, but also genuinely loved his family and was capable of real growth across seasons. Roger the Alien became one of the most creatively fertile recurring character concepts in American animated comedy, capable of inhabiting endless personas without ever losing his essential Rogerness. Francine maintained her warmth and specificity across the show's run in ways that Lois Griffin absolutely did not. The Smith family felt like a family that genuinely cared about each other even while fighting, a quality the Griffin family lost sometime around season 6 and never fully recovered. The comparison is the clearest possible refutation of the argument that Family Guy's problems were inevitable, that any show running for 25+ years will necessarily decline in these ways. American Dad has been running for roughly the same amount of time. It has not suffered the same catastrophic decline. It has not produced anything comparable to the decade of Meg abuse. It has not escalated its violence content into the territory of genuine disturbance. It has not treated its female characters with the same systematic contempt. The problems that define Family Guy's middle and later seasons are not the natural consequence of longevity. They are the consequence of specific choices made by specific people over specific seasons. American Dad proves this beyond reasonable dispute. Additional depth. The question of artistic legacy. Every long-running cultural artifact eventually reaches the point where it has to be assessed as a whole, as a body of work rather than as a series of individual episodes, and that assessment necessarily involves holding the best and worst of it in view simultaneously. For Family Guy, that assessment is particularly complicated because the distance between the best and the worst is genuinely enormous. The best of Family Guy is genuinely, durably good. The first 3 seasons contain some of the finest half hours of animated comedy that American television has ever produced. The Brian and Stewie Bank Vault episode from season 8 is a genuine masterwork of character comedy. The road to episodes, which sent Brian and Stewie on adventures together, produced some of the show's most consistently inventive and entertaining work. The voice performances throughout the show's run, McFarlane doing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire simultaneously, Alex Borstein as Lois, Seth Green as Chris, Mila Kunis as Meg. These are genuinely excellent performances that gave the characters dimensions beyond what the script sometimes provided. The worst of Family Guy is genuinely, durably problematic in ways we have spent this entire evening examining. The two things are both true and they need to be held together. The show cannot be understood honestly by selecting only one side of this ledger. What an honest artistic legacy assessment looks like, for a work this complicated, is probably this. Family Guy was a creative breakthrough that changed the form and reach of adult animated comedy produced significant quantities of genuinely excellent material, and also produced significant quantities of material that caused real harm to real communities, that reflected and reinforced harmful cultural assumptions, and that represented a sustained failure of the ethical responsibility that comes with large-scale cultural influence. It was both of these things, and the coexistence of both is more interesting and more instructive than either alone. The show will continue to be watched. It will continue to be influential. It will continue to be the subject of the kind of honest, careful examination we have tried to conduct tonight. That examination is not finished. The show is still making episodes. The cultural conversation around it is still evolving. The people whose experiences the show drew from without their full participation in how those experiences were framed are still watching, still reacting, still making their voices part of the record. And the audience, the people who loved the show and who still watch it and who carry its history with them, is part of all of this too. Not as passive recipients of influence, but as active participants in an ongoing conversation about what this particular piece of cultural history means and what we want to do with it. That conversation is one worth having carefully, with honesty about what the record contains and with genuine curiosity about what it reveals. That is what we have been trying to do tonight. It is not finished work, but it is the right kind of work to be doing. Rest well. Additional depth, The Simpsons crossover, and what it revealed. The 2014 episode, The Simpsons Guy, a crossover between Family Guy and The Simpsons that aired as the season 13 premiere, is worth examining in some depth because it is one of the most self-aware things the show has ever produced, and what it was self-aware about tells you something important about how the show understood itself at that point in its history. The episode runs roughly 44 minutes, twice the length of a standard episode, and it puts the Griffin family in Springfield for an extended period. The premise requires the two shows to acknowledge each other's existence, which means each show has to take a position on the other. The Simpsons characters are largely polite about the Griffins, with the notable exception of Bart, who has an extended conflict with Stewie. The Family Guy characters are largely awestruck by Springfield, with the notable exception of Peter, who develops a rivalry with Homer that eventually comes to consume the episode's plot. The rivalry between Peter and Homer is the episode's central comedic engine, and it is built around the specific ways these two characters are similar and different. The show's position is that Peter and Homer are basically the same character, that Family Guy owes its existence to The Simpsons, and that this is both a point of connection and a point of tension. The episode essentially admits, through the structure of its comedy, that the critique of Family Guy as a Simpsons knockoff has genuine merit, and it uses that admission as a comedic premise rather than defending against it, which is a kind of confidence, or perhaps a kind of resignation. What is more interesting than the Homer-Peter rivalry is the meta-commentary embedded throughout the episode about the specific differences between the two shows' approaches to comedy. The Simpsons characters, particularly Lisa, are consistently positioned as more thoughtful and more ethically grounded than their Family Guy equivalents. Lisa's friendship with Meg, and her encouragement of Meg, is one of the most genuinely warm sequences in the episode, and one of the most sympathetic depictions of Meg in the show's post-revival history. The implication is clear. This is what Meg could have been if she existed in a different show, a show that treated her the way Lisa treats her. The episode also contains the rape joke involving Stewie and Moe's bar that generated significant pre-broadcast controversy. Tim Winter of the Parents Television Council wrote to both Matt Groening and Seth MacFarlane before the episode aired, expressing concern about the joke. MacFarlane's response, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, was that the joke was pretty funny in his assessment. The episode aired with the joke intact. The juxtaposition of the episode's self-aware gestures toward The Simpsons' greater ethical seriousness, with the inclusion of a rape joke that generated formal pre-broadcast complaints, is itself a kind of emblem of Family Guy's entire creative history. The show was capable of acknowledging what it could have been while simultaneously doing exactly what it had always done. The crossover also illustrates something about the cultural position the two shows occupied by 2014. The Simpsons, despite its own creative decline in later seasons, maintained a cultural prestige and critical respect that Family Guy never achieved in the same way. When The Simpsons was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, it was the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. When TV Guide ranked the greatest cartoon shows of all time in 2013, Family Guy appeared at number 9. These are markers of a show that had genuinely achieved something, that had been taken seriously as a creative work by the institutions that assess such things. But the crossover, and the way the two shows positioned themselves relative to each other within it, made it clear that Family Guy understood itself as the less prestigious sibling, the one that got the audience but not the respect. This self-awareness did not produce meaningful change in the show's direction. Self-awareness without structural consequence is a feature of Family Guy's entire relationship with its own problematic history. The show knows. It has always known. It has made meta-jokes about knowing. It has had characters deliver speeches that articulate exactly what is wrong with what the show is doing, and then it has continued doing it. The knowledge existed. The will to act on the knowledge consistently did not. And a will to change that only manifests in occasional meta-jokes before returning to the status quo is not really a will to change. It is a performance of accountability without the substance of it. Additional depth, voices, casting, and who gets to tell which stories. The question of who voices which characters in Family Guy is worth examining as its own dimension of the show's history, because the casting decisions embedded assumptions about representation and authenticity that have become increasingly visible and increasingly contested over the course of the show's run. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire. These are 4 of the 6 principal characters, and all 4 are voiced by a single white man. Alex Borstein, who is white, voices Lois Griffin and also voices Tricia Takanawa, the Asian-American reporter we discussed at length earlier. Seth Green, who is white and who is actually Jewish, voices Chris Griffin. Mike Henry, who is white, voiced Cleveland Brown for over 20 seasons and also voiced Herbert the Pervert. The concentration of voice talent in a small group of white performers, voicing both white and non-white characters, was the standard practice in American animated comedy for most of the 20th century. It was how animation was produced. The economics of voice recording, the preference for established performers, the simple fact that the people making hiring decisions tended to hire people like themselves, all of these factors contributed to this pattern. Family Guy did not invent it, but Family Guy's specific deployment of this pattern had consequences that went beyond the general problem of representation in animation. When Alex Borstein voices both Lois Griffin and Tricia Takanawa, the contrast between the two performances is audible in ways that make the caricature visible. Lois is voiced with warmth and specificity. Tricia is voiced in a way that codes her immediately as a stereotype through vocal performance alone, before a single word of dialogue has been delivered. The voice is doing the work of signaling this is a caricature that the visual design and the dialogue then reinforce. The joke begins in the casting. Similarly, when Mike Henry voiced Cleveland Brown, the performance was competent and affectionate in its way. Henry clearly liked the character and put genuine effort into the performance. But the disconnect between the performer and the character's experience was audible in specific ways, particularly in episodes that were supposed to engage directly with Cleveland's experience as a black man. Those episodes tended to gesture toward that experience rather than inhabit it, to name it from the outside rather than speak from the inside, in ways that a black performer with direct access to that experience might not have done. The broader casting question is not just about individual performances. It is about the signal that casting choices send to audiences, and particularly to audiences who belong to the groups being represented. When a show casts white performers to voice characters of color, the implied message is that the authentic experience of those communities is not required to tell their stories adequately, that their perspectives are available for performance by anyone, that there is nothing specific or irreplaceable about their particular experience that requires their own presence in the room. This message, transmitted through casting decisions across decades, contributes to a cultural environment in which the experiences of those communities are understood as raw material rather than as perspectives with their own authority. The 2020 recasting of Cleveland, Quagmire's father Ida, and several other characters of color in various animated shows was a significant cultural moment precisely because it represented a public acknowledgement of this dynamic. The performers who stepped aside, including Mike Henry, deserve credit for recognizing and responding to the problem. But the timing of the acknowledgement, coming 20 years into the show's run, is itself part of the story. The problem existed for 20 years before the cultural environment made addressing it feel necessary. For 20 years, the casting decisions were made without sufficient examination of what they were saying and what they were doing. This is the pattern across everything we have examined tonight. The problems were real from the beginning. The acknowledgments arrived later. The acknowledgments were prompted by external pressure rather than by internal reckoning. And the question of whether the acknowledgments represent genuine change or simply a response to changed external conditions is one that only the ongoing behavior of the show and the people making it can answer.